At a low point in his life, Xiao Ruofei discovered that a scroll that was passed down in his family had a hidden secret. It contained its own independent world. In the space, there was a spiritual pond that enhanced the growth of plants. There were mysterious spiritual flowers that could cure illnesses. Time in the independent world flowed at a pace 10 times that of the outside world. Everything he planted there was of supreme grade and grew at a rapid pace. Everything he raised gained sentience. From that day forth, Xiao Ruofei began a different, brilliant life of planting succulent plants and vegetables, raising animals and flirting with beauties. It was a winter afternoon in Three Mountain City of the southeast province, in the Three Mountain Plaza in the southern suburbs. Amidst the rush of people, a young man with a slightly pale face walked forward steadily. His name was Xiao Ruofei. He was 23 years old that year and was a soldier who had just retired from the military camp. Xiao Ruofei was not tall. He was about 1.75 meters tall, and his figure was thin. He had short, spiky hair and wore a brown Type 07 winter camouflage uniform. On his feet was a pair of standard black high-laced combat boots. However, there were no military ranks or military insignias on the old camouflage uniform. The combat boots were also badly damaged. The paint on several areas had been worn off, making them look like ugly scars. Even though Xiao Ruofei's clothes were old, they were clean and gave off a refreshing feeling. But no matter what, his attire made him look out of place among the people in the city. He would even attract curious and contemptuous gazes. However, Xiao Ruofei turned a blind eye to them. His back remained straight, and he walked forward with 75 centimeters per step. He was full of vigor and exuded a strong military aura. Xiao Ruofei held a receipt in his hand, and his pale face was filled with worry. "Hu Zi, this is all I can do. I even sold the house that my grandfather left behind." Xiao Ruofei muttered softly to himself. "With this money, at least our mother can afford dialysis. As for the kidney transplant, I really can't do anything about it. Sai, I hope you can understand. In a few days, the two of us will meet in the underworld. I'll pay my apologies to you then." After saying that, Xiao Ruofei let out a long sigh, feeling melancholic. Hu Zi was Xiao Ruofei's best comrade and brother in the army. He was shot and sacrificed in a border battle to protect him. 2 years after Hu Zi's death, Xiao Ruofei was diagnosed with motor neuron disease, commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. The symptoms in the early stages of this disease were mild, and the patient might only feel a little weak, jumpy, and tired. However, it would gradually progress to muscle atrophy and difficulty in swallowing. Under the current standards of medical treatment, motor neuron disease was considered an incurable disease. He could live for as short as a few months, or as long as 2 to 3 years. Most patients would die from respiratory failure. After understanding the situation of this illness, Xiao Ruofei resolutely requested to leave the army, unwilling to cause trouble for the organization. Of course, more importantly, Xiao Ruofei was a prideful person deep down. He had always been the backbone of the lone wolf assault team. He did not want his comrades to see him struggle to even move his fingers, and could only lie on the bed and watch as death devoured him. After Xiao Ruofei retired, he went to Hu Zi's house to visit his old mother. However, he suddenly found out that Hu Zi's mother was suffering from uremia. Hu Zi's meager pension had long been spent, but his condition did not improve at all. Without hesitation, Xiao Ruofei sold the small house left behind by his grandfather at a low price. He had gone to the bank to transfer the 400,000 yuan he had earned from selling the house and his military discharge fee of 80,000 yuan to Hu Zi's mother's account. But he himself had become penniless. Now, other than the 2 months' rent that he had paid in advance, the few $100s in his pocket were Xiao Ruofei's entire assets. After passing by the new Banyan Road beside the Three Mountain Plaza, the scenery in front of him suddenly changed. The prosperity of the city was left behind. All he could see were low-rise houses with all kinds of electrical wires running around and trees growing messily around. The water drains by the side of the road gave off a stench, and all kinds of trash could be seen everywhere. This was a shantytown in the town. In this new era, it gave off an aged and rotten aura. Fortunately, it was said that this shantytown would be demolished in a year or two. After Xiao Ruofei sold the house, He rented the cheapest single room to stay in. Xiao Ruofei's parents had died early, and his only family member, Grandpa, had also passed away. He was all alone, so it was enough for him to rent a small apartment. He quickly walked through the streets. He did not even frown at the stench that occasionally entered his nostrils. In his military career, he had experienced more than 100 times worse environments. This was nothing. Let go of me. Help. In the distance, a faint voice could be heard. He frowned slightly and walked quickly in the direction of the voice. Normally, Xiao Ruofei was not someone who liked to poke his nose into other people's business. However, the security in the shantytown was very poor. There were all sorts of people around, and the cry for help sounded like that of a young woman. There was a strong sense of panic in her voice. If he did not take actions, something terrible might happen. He walked quickly through the narrow alley. In front of an abandoned house, Xiao Ruofei saw 3 drunk hooligans surrounding a panicked girl with smiles on their faces. The girl was wearing a short white down jacket and blue jeans. She had a pair of long and slender legs, and her slightly bloated winter attire could not hide her graceful and tall figure. She had an exquisite oval face, and her big eyes, which should have been lively, were now filled with fear. Her beautiful hair was also a little messy, and her body involuntarily shivered, making her look even more pitiful. Xiao Ruofei thought to himself, why did such a beautiful girl come here alone? Wasn't she asking for trouble? Help! Big brother, save me! The girl saw Xiao Ruofei and pleaded as if she had found a straw to clutch at. This place was remote, and it was rare for people to pass by. It was also because of this that the 3 hoodlums dared to act so brazenly under the influence of alcohol. They obviously did not expect anyone to come. They looked at Xiao Ruofei standing at the entrance of the alley and were stunned. The leader, a gangster with yellow hair, sized Xiao Ruofei up and laughed eerily. Oh, you're a soldier. You're not thinking of saving the damsel in distress, are you? I'm in a good mood today, so I won't argue with you. Be sensible and get lost. Xiao Ruofei looked at the yellow-haired gangster calmly. I'll give you 3 seconds to let go of that girl. I can pretend nothing happened. The yellow-haired gangster was stunned. He exchanged glances with his 2 companions, and the 3 of them burst into laughter. The yellow-haired gangster pointed at Xiao Ruofei's nose and cursed. You ****. Have you become King senile from being a soldier or something? How dare you talk to me like this? Time's up, Xiao Ruofei said softly. The moment he finished speaking, the yellow-haired gangster felt his vision blur. Xiao Ruofei, who was 2 meters away, appeared in front of him in a flash. Immediately after, the yellow-haired gangster felt a strong force on his chest and abdomen. He flew out involuntarily and landed on his, but in a waterhole. The dirty and smelly sewage water instantly splashed all over his body. Xiao Ruofei was so fast that the 3 hooligans did not even have time to react. Xiao Ruoxin's attack was so powerful that it gave the 3 of them a shock. A hint of fear appeared in their eyes, whereas Xiao Ruofei frowned and thought to himself, this damn illness is getting worse. When he attacked just now, he felt the weakness in his limbs worsen. His kick should have caused the yellow-haired gangster to lose his ability to move. Yet although he was covered in dirty water, he quickly stood up. On the other side, the alcohol emboldened the yellow-haired gangster, who placed his hand on his waist. The fear in his eyes disappeared when he felt the tool that would give him an upper hand. Then, he glared at Xiao Ruofei fiercely and pulled out the dagger from his waist. He licked his lips and said grimly, Brat, you are courting death. The other 2 hooligans took out their daggers at the same time and flung the girl aside. The 3 of them surrounded Xiao Ruofei. The girl covered her mouth in horror. Xiao Ruofei calmly protected the girl behind him. He gritted his teeth and rushed towards the 3 people who were surrounding him. The girl looked at Xiao Ruofei's slightly skinny figure. Her eyes were covered with a layer of mist, and his back view seemed to become taller in an instant. Xiao Ruofei landed a beautiful kick on the yellow-haired gangster's shoulder. There was a loud crack, and the yellow-haired gangster fell to the ground in pain. He started howling in pain. Xiao Ruofei did not hold back when facing the 3 daggers swung at him. After knocking out the yellow-haired gangster, Xiao Ruofei turned sideways and dodged another thug's dagger. The dagger flashed past his eyes. The situation was extremely dangerous. The girls screamed in fear. The two hooligans exchanged glances. Gritting their teeth, they brandished their daggers and charged forward again. Xiaoruofei calmly took a step forward and took the opportunity to snatch it. His swift steps allowed him to always stand between the hooligans and the girl. Seizing the opportunity, Xiaoruofei rushed forward and accurately grabbed a hooligan's wrist. If it was in the past, the gangster's wrist would be broken in the next second. However, at this moment, Xiaoruofei once again felt weak in his limbs. He cursed in his heart. Gritting his teeth, he pulled hard and dodged to the side with the hoodlum. However, he was still half a beat slower. A cold light flashed past, and with a sizzling sound, the other hooligan's dagger cut through Xiaoruofei's camouflage training suit, leaving a long wound on his arm. Fresh blood flowed out. Xiaoruofei, who was unexpectedly injured, did not change his expression as he hit the hooligan's face with his elbow, knocking him unconscious. Then, he grabbed the other hooligan's wrist and threw him over the shoulders, causing him to fall onto the ground with a loud thud. The thug rolled his eyes and fainted. The girl was stunned. She did not expect this skinny man to be so strong. In less than 20 seconds, he had defeated all three of them barehanded. However, Xiaoruofei frowned slightly. If not for that damn illness, this kind of untrained street ruffian would have been defeated in one move. Now he was even injured. This was simply embarrassing the special forces. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. He looked down at his trembling hands. Was there really no other way? Keeping his emotions in check, he turned to the girl and said, "Hurry up and leave. It's not very safe here. It's best if you don't come out alone." "Thank you. I got it," the girl said gratefully. Following that, she exclaimed, "Aya, your arm is bleeding." Xiaoruofei looked down at the wound on his arm nonchalantly and waved his hand. "It's nothing, just a small injury." "I'll accompany you to the hospital to bandage it," the girl said. "You were injured because of me. No need. Leave quickly. I should go back too." Xiaoruofei shook his head. "That won't do. What if it gets infected?" The girl tugged at Xiaoruofei's sleeve and said, "Let's go to the hospital. I'll go with you." Xiaoruofei gently shook off the girl's hand and said, "There's really no need. Goodbye." After saying that, Xiaoruofei strode forward. The girl wanted to chase after him, but she had sprained her ankle in the scuffle with the three hooligans. She was limping and could not keep up with Xiaoruofei, who was running as fast as he could. She could only shout from behind, "Hey, I still don't know your name." Xiaoruofei did not reply. He waved his hand without looking back and quickly disappeared around the corner of the house. The girl looked at the yellow-haired man who was howling in pain and the two unconscious hoodlums. She was very scared and did not dare to stay here for long. She could only stare deeply in the direction where Xiaoruofei had disappeared before limping away from the scene. Xiaoruofei quickly returned to his new residence. It was a small room that was less than 10 square meters. Other than a bed and a table, there was almost no place to rest. He pulled out a box from under the bed and rummaged through it. Xiaoruofei had just moved over and had yet to unpack his things when he went to transfer money to Hu Zi's mother. He remembered that he had placed the first aid kit in this suitcase when he moved. The wound on his arm was quite long and deep. He had to treat it in time. The box was a little messy. There were military medals that he had brought back from the army and some small items given by his comrades. There were also some old items left behind by his deceased grandfather. It was obviously difficult to find a small first aid kit at once. Xiaoruofei did not realize that while he was rummaging, a drop of blood dripped from the wound on his arm and landed on an unassuming scroll in the box. When the blood landed on the surface of the scroll, it was like a snowflake falling into boiling water. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared without a trace. After absorbing a drop of Xiaoruofei's blood, the scroll suddenly emitted a faint golden glow, attracting Xiaoruofei's gaze. Xiaoruofei was stunned. What was going on? Xiaoruofei vaguely remembered that when his grandfather was still alive, he would often fiddle with the scroll in his hand. It looked like an old item, but that was all. After so many years, Xiaoruofei did not find anything special about it. Xiaoruofei even vaguely remembered that when this scroll was opened, it was a painting. The contents of the painting were very simple. It was just a piece of grassland with a clear spring. When he was young, Xiao Ruofei had asked his grandfather about the background of this painting out of curiosity. In the end, even his grandfather did not know much about it. He only knew that it was passed down from his ancestors. Why would an inconspicuous painting suddenly emit golden light? What exactly is going on? Xiao Ruofei muttered to himself as he reached out to pick up the scroll and slowly opened it with a curious expression. However, it was different from the past. The moment Xiao Ruofei opened the scroll, the golden light intensified. Then, he suddenly felt a huge pulling force coming from the painting. Immediately after, he felt his vision blur, as if he had teleported. In the next moment, he realized that he had appeared in a completely unfamiliar place. This was too strange. The instinct from being in the special forces made Xiao Ruofei instinctively make a defensive move. Then he quickly scanned his surroundings, hoping to find a safe hiding spot to avoid being attacked from both sides. However, he soon discovered that the location he was in was practically unobstructed. There was no place for him to use as a bunker. He was standing on a land of black soil. This piece of land was estimated to be only 1 acre or so. Looking around, he could see the end of it. The area beyond 1 acre was covered in faint green fog. With Xiao Ruofei's eyesight, he could not see anything beyond. At the center of this black land was a clear spring. The spring water gurgled out, forming a small pond about 1 meter in radius. Beside the pond, there was a plant that he could not identify. It was about 1 foot tall and had long leaves that were 2 fingers wide. The leaves were green and looked full of vitality. Of course, the most eye-catching thing was the flower growing on the plant. This flower only had 3 petals, and each petal was different in color. They were blue, yellow, and red. However, this simple flower that had 3 petals gave off a delicate and alluring feeling, as if it contained the truths of the world. Even Xiao Ruofei, who was still in shock, couldn't help but stare at the flower for a few more seconds. However, he quickly regained his focus. Now was not the time to be distracted. He was clearly looking for a first aid kit in the rental apartment earlier. Why did he suddenly appear in this strange place? The surroundings and the area above were all shrouded in a hazy green mist, and he was unable to see through. Hence, Xiao Ruofei's top priority was to find a way out and leave this place. Hence, the first thing Xiao Ruofei did after regaining his senses was to walk towards the boundary of the land. This piece of black land was almost circular, with a diameter of about 28 to 29 meters. Soon, Xiao Ruofei arrived at the edge. He reached out his hand tentatively and soon discovered that the mist was like an invisible barrier. A soft but tough force blocked his hand. Xiao Ruofei did not believe it. He took a few steps forward and changed another position to continue testing out. The result was the same. The green fog looked extremely thin, but not only could it block one's vision, it also formed a barrier that could not be seen with the naked eye. This barrier did not have any lethality, but it was extremely tough and could not be penetrated. What should I do? Xiao Ruofei could not help but mutter to himself. There is no way out. Helpless, he could only return to the small pond at the center of the land. Suddenly, Xiao Ruofei widened his eyes and looked around quickly. The more he looked, the more surprised he seemed. Why is it so similar to the contents of the painting? Xiao Ruofei could not help but mutter to himself. There was a circular piece of land with a clear spring in the middle. There was a nameless plant beside the pond, and there was a misty green fog around it. Xiao Ruofei remembered seeing this painting when he was young. Other than the lack of green grass on the ground, it was exactly the same as the painting he had seen before. Could it be that I'm in that painting? Xiao Ruofei had a bold thought. Xiao Ruofei was also shocked by his own thoughts, but the more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. After all, the changes in environment was only after he opened the scroll. Xiao Ruofei had been in the army for many years and had received much education. At that moment, he felt as if his worldview had collapsed. He stood beside the pond in a daze for a long while. Xiao Ruofei, who had gone through the harsh training in the Lone Wolf Assault Team, had an extremely calm mind. No matter what, he would not lose his cool. However, such a strange experience still made his mind temporarily blank. After a long while, he thought of a serious problem. How should he leave this place? For an elite of the special forces to be trapped in a painting without being able to do anything, this was truly a huge joke. Xiao Ruofei smiled bitterly and muttered to himself, God, am I going to be trapped here forever? I want to go out. Just as he finished speaking, Xiao Ruofei suddenly felt his vision blur. That familiar pulling force and dizziness struck him again. In the next moment, he realized that he had returned to the messy rental apartment. In his hand was the painting. Xiao Ruofei widened his mouth in shock. It is actually controlled by voice? That can't be. He couldn't help but cast his gaze at the painting in his hand. This painting still looked ordinary. The old scroll was covered in mottled traces, and it was obvious that it had the aura of time. Xiao Ruofei carefully observed the contents of the painting, and was even more certain that he had just entered the painting. As an elite of the special forces, he would subconsciously remember many details. For example, the plant by the pond that he couldn't name, as well as the delicate and beautiful flower with only 3 petals on it. With a glance, Xiao Ruofei quickly spotted the plant in the painting. The flower on it, and even the veins of the leaves, were exactly the same as what he saw by the pond. There was actually a hidden secret within the painting. There was another mysterious space within it. The usually calm Xiao Ruofei could not help but become very agitated. He had found a treasure this time. In his excitement, there was something else that Xiao Ruofei could not understand. That was, this painting had been in their family for many generations. In Xiao Ruofei's memories, there was a period of time when his grandfather would open to admire it. Even when Xiao Ruofei was young, he had also mischievously opened this painting. But both his grandfather and himself had never been directly pulled into the painting space. Xiao Ruofei pondered for a while. In the end, he could only attribute it to the blood from his wound on the painting. Besides this reason, Xiao Ruofei could not find any other reason. He no longer dwelled on this issue and turned to study this mysterious painting scroll. After half a day of repeated testing, Xiao Ruofei finally figured out some basic functions of the painting space. First of all, it was very easy for him to enter and exit this space. He only needed to think about it, and he could enter or leave. Furthermore, he could bring things into the space, but he had to hold on to those items. Secondly, if he went in and out of the space repeatedly, it seemed like he would become mentally exhausted. However, the pond in the space was very effective in restoring one's mental state. It was even helpful for treating physical injuries. After Xiao Ruofei drank some water from the pond, he realized that the knife wound on his arm was already showing signs of scabbing. This discovery surprised and delighted Xiao Ruofei. The rental apartment was too cramped. After selling the house, he could not bear to throw away many of his grandfather's belongings, so the room was almost full. Now that there was this magical space, Xiao Ruofei simply moved all the items into the space after making a few trips. The room instantly felt much more spacious. He drank a few mouthfuls of water from the pond to recover his energy. Then, he sat down by the pond and gazed at the clear spiritual water in deep thought. Slowly calming down, Xiao Ruofei began to think about how to make use of this magical spiritual space to earn as much money as possible. Hu Zi's mother was diagnosed with uremia. The total of 500,000 that Xiao Ruofei earned from selling the house and his retirement fund had been given to Hu Zi's mother. However, Hu Zi's family still owed a huge debt, and the money that Xiao Ruofei gave would definitely not be enough for a kidney transplant. Hence, Xiao Ruofei wanted to raise as much money as possible while he still had the energy. Xiao Ruofei knew that his days were numbered. Patients with Lou Gehrig's disease only lived for 2 to 3 years at most. Xiao Ruofei originally wanted to earn as much money as possible while he could still move and leave it to Hu Zi's mother. Now that he suddenly obtained the mysterious spiritual map, Xiao Ruofei's mind started to run fast. Xiao Ruofei immediately rejected the idea of selling it for money. That was because this spiritual map was truly too magical. It had already far surpassed the scope of normal people's imagination. Xiao Ruofei knew very well that if he sold this painting rashly, not only would he not be able to get the money, it would also draw disaster. Xiao Ruofei quickly made up his mind. Not only could he not sell it openly, he had to keep it as his top secret. He could not even leak it to his closest friends. Since he couldn't sell it for money, he should at least make use of this treasure to earn some money for himself. Otherwise, it would be such a waste, Xiaoruofei thought. However, as to how he could make use of the spiritual map to earn money, Xiaoruofei did not have any good ideas at the moment. After all, he knew very little about this space. The only thing he knew was that the water in the pond seemed to be beneficial for recovering one's mental strength and physical injuries. However, the pond only had a radius of 1 meter. He could not possibly drain the water and sell it. This was equivalent to having a mountain of treasure, but it could not be exchanged for real money. Xiaoruofei could not help but smile bitterly. He frowned and thought for a while. Then, he shook his head and muttered to himself, "Forget it, let's go out and get some food first. The emperor doesn't lack hungry soldiers." With that, Xiaoruofei prepared to leave the space. At this moment, his gaze landed on a small flower pot. He couldn't help but stare blankly at it. Xiaorufan remembered that this flower pot was left behind by the previous tenant. For some reason, he had also brought this flower pot into the space when he was packing up the miscellaneous items. There was a small green lotus-shaped plant in the flower pot. Its leaves were plump and thick, and there were some brown vein-like patterns on it. It looked quite pretty. However, perhaps due to neglect, the plant looked listless. Xiaoruofei shook his head and reached out to pick up the flower pot, preparing to bring it out. Xiaoruofei did not have the hobby of raising potted plants. Since it did not belong to an owner, he would just find a time to throw it outside. He could not even afford to feed himself. Why would he raise a potted plant? However, on second thought, he muttered to himself, forget it. Since I brought you in just now, it's fate. I'll leave you here." The soil in the flower pot was still filled with large amounts of small pebbles. It looked like it was completely dry without any moisture. When Xiaoruofei saw this scene, he simply carried the flower pot to the side of the pond and used his hands to fetch some water to water the plant. He waited until the soil in the flower pot was completely drenched before standing up and leaving the space. As for the potted plant, Xiaoruofei simply left it in the spiritual space. Back in his room, Xiaoruofei made a simple bowl of instant noodles for his lunch. Then he cleaned up the room. He was so tired that he was panting slightly. He even sweated a lot. Ever since he contracted Lou Gehrig's disease, Xiaoruofei's physical strength had decreased very quickly. When he was in the military, such a small amount of exercise could not even make him sweat, let alone feel tired. He took a towel and went to the public washroom outside to take a quick shower. Then he returned to his room and lay on the bed to rest. Unknowingly, Xiaoruofei fell into a deep sleep. When Xiaoruofei woke up again, it was already dark outside. He looked at the time on his knockoff phone and realized that it was already 6:30 p.m. This meant that he had slept for 4 to 5 hours. After waking up, Xiaoruofei's mouth was a little dry. He shook the painting that he had clutched tightly when he was sleeping. With a thought, he disappeared from the room and entered the spiritual map space. The water in the pond made Xiaoruofei hungry. When he felt thirsty, he immediately thought of getting some water to drink. He appeared in the space and walked straight to the pond. However, when he saw the flower pot by the pond, his gaze couldn't help but freeze and an expression of disbelief appeared on his face. He quickly walked over to the flower pot. Xiaoruofei realized that the plants in the flower pot were different from before. The most obvious change was its size. It had become as big as a balloon. In addition, it was no longer withered and looked like it could die at any moment. The leaves had become crystal clear, as if they were carved from jade. It was magical and beautiful, fresh and elegant, as if it was a work of art with life. There was an even more obvious change: the color of the leaves. The outermost area was still very green, but the color of the inner area had changed. It had a color gradation from light to deep. The innermost area had become a beautiful purple. At the top of the leaf, there were some transparent veins. One could see the sparkling and translucent meaty leaves inside at a glance, which were as clear and transparent as ice lamps. A half-dead potted plant had become so magical and beautiful. It would not be an exaggeration to say that it had been reborn. It was Xiaoruofei's first time seeing such a beautiful potted plant. He could not help but stare in a daze. For a moment, he even forgot that he came in to find water to drink, because he was thirsty. After looking at it for a long time, Xiao Ruofei unwillingly moved his gaze away from the crystal-clear potted plant and looked at the clear pond with excitement. Without a doubt, the reason why the potted plant underwent such a drastic change in such a short period of time was most likely because he had watered it with water from the pond previously. Of course, he could not rule out the possibility that the spiritual map space itself had a great effect on the growth of plants. Regardless of the reason, Xiao Ruofei had at least found a way to make money. After Xiao Ruoxin left the spiritual map space, the first thing he did was to search for information about the potted plant online. Although the rental house was dilapidated and narrow, the facilities were still complete. This place was mainly rented to city workers or young people who had just graduated from university. Therefore, every room had a network access point. The desktop computer he had bought before joining the army had now become useful. After waiting for 2 to 3 minutes, the old desktop was finally turned on. Xiao Ruofei opened the browser and entered the search engine to search for information. He searched for a long time, but didn't find much useful information. However, he did find out that the lotus-shaped plant's name was Jade Dew and belonged to the 12th volume of the encyclopedia. It was also one of the more popular cactus-type plant. There were many types of Jade Dew. Xiao Ruofei searched for a long time, but could not find out what kind of Jade Dew was in the space and how much it was worth. However, Xiao Ruofei was certain that before the transformation of the Jade Dew, it was an extremely ordinary breed. The previous tenant was also not taking care of it, and it was basically in a half-dead state. Furthermore, it was left behind in a room when they moved, so it was definitely not worth much. As for the mutated Jade Dew, Xiao Ruofei could not find out anything about it. Therefore, he simply entered the space again and took a few photos of the Jade Dew with his phone. Then, he returned to his room and uploaded the photos to the online forum for cactus plants. After uploading it, Xiao Ruofei did not bother about it anymore. He turned off the computer, showered, and went to sleep. The next morning, after Xiao Ruofei washed up, he did not even have time for breakfast. He took out the spiritual map that he kept close to himself and entered the spiritual map space. The moment he entered, Xiao Ruofei realized that the pot of Jade Dew had grown a lot bigger. The leaves were even more tender and had changed from a tender green to a purple color. The layers within the leaves were even more distinct. The spots on the top of the leaves were almost completely transparent. The meaty leaves inside were crystal clear, making one feel like pinching them. This space was really magical. A pot of ordinary Jade Dew that was about to dry up had only been watered with some water, and then put in the space for a night, and it had actually undergone a complete transformation. Xiao Ruofei was very excited. He remembered the post the previous day, so he left the space and sat in front of the computer. Xiao Ruofei had just logged into his account on the forum when he received a series of notifications, which made him shocked. On closer look, there were almost 200 private messages. It was a new account that was registered the previous night for the post. Why did so many people send him private messages overnight? Xiao Ruofei mumbled to himself as she opened the private messages. Brother, where did you get this supreme-grade Jade Dew? It's so beautiful. This is the best ice lantern Jade Dew. Oh my God! Are you sure you didn't Photoshop this picture? How can there be such a clear Jade Dew? The comments were all about the photos that Xiao Ruofei uploaded the day before. Xiao Ruofei was not surprised because his account had only made 2 posts. The contents of the 2 posts were the same. Please tell me what kind of Jade Dew this is. Is it worth a lot of money? Then he attached a photo. One of them was posted on the Succulent Plant Forum, while the other was posted on the Jade Dew Forum. Some comments were even more direct. I want this supreme-grade ice lantern. Name any price. Phone number 136XXXXXXXX. Even through the computer screen, he could feel that the person was rich. Initially, Xiao Ruofei only thought that the pot of Jade Dew looked much better after watering with the water from the pond the day before. As he did not have a deep understanding of the succulent plants, he did not know that his posts had already caused an uproar on both forums. Xiao Ruofei did not know what ice lantern Jade Dew was, but it looked like it was worth a lot of money. He opened his post with anticipation. Compared to the private messages, the post was even more lively. The two posts had dozens of pages of replies overnight. There were at least 1,000 or 2,000 replies. It was as if the entire forum site had exploded. Not only were there many comments in Xiaoruofei's post, but there were also quite a number of new posts discussing the jade that Xiaoruofei had posted. Whether it was a reply or a new post, the views were roughly divided into two factions, positive and negative. One side naturally bowed down to Xiaoruofei. They were full of admiration for Xiaoruofei for being able to nurture such supreme-grade ice lantern jade dew. There were even people who clamored to acknowledge Xiaoruofei as their master. The other group was skeptical. Some people suspected that the pot of jade dew was not ice lantern. The reason was simple. They had never seen an ice lantern that had color gradation from green to purple. Many people said that it was fake and had been applied with coloring. Furthermore, this pot of jade dew was crystal clear and looked like real jade. Some people even swore that it was definitely photoshopped by him. A veteran who owned multiple succulent plants said that he had been exposed to many types of plants for more than 10 years and had never seen such a perfect ice lantern jade dew. This also indirectly proved that the picture had been photoshopped. The supporters refuted these views one by one. They analyzed the photo from different angles and insisted that it was definitely an ice lantern. Furthermore, it was an extremely rare variant. It was extremely beautiful and was definitely the best among ice lanterns and jade dews. There were also many succulent plant owners who worked in the graphic design industry and analyzed from a technical point of view. They claimed that the photos were all original and had not even been edited. They were just raw images. In short, the two forums were in a heated argument because of Xiaoruofei's post. Xiaoruofei flipped through the posts and private messages and could not help but grin. Xiaoruofei did not know any of the professional terms of side sprouts, brocade, tree type. However, he was certain that the jade dew would be very valuable. What Xiaoruofei lacked the most now was money. That's great. When he heard that Xiaoruofei was willing to sell it, he was very happy. He quickly said, "You will definitely not lose out on the sale. Furthermore, since you are able to cultivate such a supreme-grade ice lantern, you must be an expert. No one would dare to deceive you." With that said, Cold-Stirred Succulent eagerly said, "Master Bloodwolf, please give me an address. I'll be right there. How about I go over to your place? I'll come over in the afternoon." Xiaoruofei thought for a while and said, "Didn't you say you have a lot of succulent plants? I want to visit your greenhouse too." Xiaoruofei saw the hope of earning money from this ice lantern, so he naturally wanted to understand more about succulent plants. It was definitely not as good to look up information online as in real life. This cold-stirred succulent was obviously an easygoing person, so Xiaoruofei wanted to learn more about succulent plants from him. Therefore, he decided to go personally. The moment he heard that, Cold-Stirred Succulent was even happier and he hurriedly said, "Welcome, welcome, Master Bloodwolf. I'll send you the address immediately." Not long after hanging up, Xiaoruofei received a text message on his phone. It was the address from Cold-Stirred Succulent. Xiaoruofei took out the spiritual map that was hidden on his body and entered the spiritual map space with a thought. He walked over, picked up the supreme-grade ice lantern jade dew, and left the spiritual space in a flash. Xiaoruofei found a large plastic bag and packed the jade dew. Then he made some simple lunch at home. After he finished eating, he carried the plastic bag containing the jade dew and prepared to leave. Just as he reached the door, Xiaoruofei felt his hand go soft. The plastic bag almost slipped out of his hand. He quickly reached out his other hand to grab the plastic bag. He stopped and steadied his steps. After a while, the weakness in his hand gradually disappeared. Xiaoruofei could not help but smile bitterly. That damn Lou Gehrig's disease seemed to be getting worse. After so many years of battle experience, Xiaoruofei was used to seeing life and death. Furthermore, he had been diagnosed with this illness for some time, so he was not too afraid of death. However, he still felt a sense of urgency in his heart. It seemed like he had to speed up the pace of earning money. He had to earn enough money for Hu Zi's mother to get a kidney transplant before he couldn't move. Otherwise, he would be too ashamed to face Hu Zi. After calming himself down, Xia Ruofei walked out of the rental apartment with firm steps. In order to save time, he hailed a taxi and drove straight to the Immortal Succulent store in Anhua District. In the suburbs of Anhua District, at the entrance of a 10-acre plantation with the sign, Immortal Succulent Store, hanging, 2 security guards stood guard in high spirits. This was because their boss, who rarely appeared, had brought a few friends to the cultivation base that day. There was a 3-story building in the cultivation base. It was the daily office for the store. The walls on the entire 3rd floor had been removed. It was the exclusive floor for the store owner's use. It was a large office that was more than 200 square meters. There was a lounge, a reception area, a gym area, and even a professional snooker table and an indoor golf course. At this moment, there were 4 or 5 youngsters sitting around the coffee table in the reception area. One of them was about 25 or 26 years old, wearing a fitted suit. His eyebrows were very thick and his eyes were bright. This young man was skillfully making tea for everyone. The rest of the people were also dressed exquisitely, and they seemed about the same age as the tea-brewing youth. There was also a girl in her early 20s sitting with them. This girl was very beautiful. Her exquisite face was almost flawless, and her skin was so delicate that it seemed like it could break with a blow. Especially her long legs. Any man who saw her would involuntarily imagine the scene of placing her long legs on his shoulders. Such a beautiful girl naturally became the center of attention. However, this beautiful girl was a little cold. She remained indifferent towards the people around her. These people were the children of some entrepreneurs in Three Mountain City. They could be considered the typical rich second-generation heirs. The young man who brewed the tea was called Liang Qichao. His father was the owner of Jianda Corporation, a well-known property enterprise in the city. Liang Qichao was the owner of the Immortal Succulent store. He was the cold-stirred succulent that Xia Ruofei contacted. Of course, Liang Qichao was just playing around, mainly because he liked succulent plants. The long-legged beauty's name was Ling Qingxue. Her father was Ling Xiaotian, the boss of the food industry in Three Mountain City. Her family's Ling Ji restaurant chain was very influential in the entire southeast province and had at least several hundred million assets. Of the remaining 3 youngsters, the slightly plump one was called Lu Wan. His family also worked in the food and beverage industry. His family's famous restaurant chain had the same influence as Ling Ji's restaurant chain. The other young man with smooth hair and a middle hair parting was called Lu Mingho. His family was involved in the real estate business. Being in the same industry meant that they were nemesis, so he and Liang Qichao had never been on good terms. The last person who wore gold-framed glasses was Lu Ping. He was also a rich second-generation heir. His family was in the logistics industry. Of course, these youths all had a common identity, Ling Qingshue's admirers. Thus, there was a faint sense of competition between these men. In reality, Ling Qingxue was the one who really liked the succulent plants. Liang Qichao was influenced by Ling Qingxue and slowly fell in love with the adorable succulent plants. Later on, he even opened this Immortal Succulent store. Lu Mingho, Lu Wan, and Lu Ping also tried to win her over with her interests. They found some precious succulent plants and gave them to Ling Qingxue, but Ling Qingxue probably didn't like them. This time, Ling Qingxue heard from Liang Qichao that he had found a pot of supreme-grade ice lanterns online, and Liang Qichao had even praised it to the skies. That was why Ling Qingxue was a little tempted and came to the store. Lu Mingho and the others also followed them, but only they knew what they were planning. Liang Qichao brought the first cup of tea to the girl and smiled while saying, "Qingxue, I didn't expect you to come here to join in the fun. My humble place is honored by your presence." The girl named Qingxue said indifferently, "I'm just a little curious about the supreme-grade ice lantern you mentioned. I hope it won't disappoint me later." Lu Mingho grinned and said, "Qingxue, I think Liang Qichao must have been deceived. You saw the picture just now. How could there be such a beautiful ice lantern? Needless to say, it must have been photoshopped." Lu Mingho and Liang Qichao were both wooing Ling Qingxue, and their families were in real estate development, so they naturally wouldn't let go of the opportunity to attack Liang Qichao. The slightly plump Luan added, "I think what Mingho said makes sense. There are many scammers online now. Liang Qichao, you can't trust others too easily." Although his words sounded kind, He was actually mocking Liang Qichao for not having any real-world experience and for being deceived. Liang Qichao snorted and said, "It's not the first time I've played with succulents. How could I not tell if it's real or fake? Besides, we're doing a face-to-face transaction. If it's photoshopped, how would he dare to come? Wouldn't he be exposed once they see the goods?" Lu Mingho chuckled. "Even if it wasn't photoshopped, it could have been dyed with coloring. It looks beautiful, but it'll be revealed in a few days." The silent Lu Ping adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and said, "No matter what, we can just appraise it together later. How can we not be able to tell if it's real or fake? Then let's see what happens next." Luwen laughed. The few men were engaged in a verbal sparring while the main character, Ling Qingxue, remained calm throughout. She sat on the sofa and occasionally took a sip of her tea, looking elegant and beautiful. At this moment, the phone on the desk rang. Liang Qichao got up and walked over to press the speaker button. He heard the security officer's voice on the phone. "Director Liang, there's a young man at the door. He said that he has an appointment with you to make a deal on the succulent plant." Liang Qichao immediately said, "Tell him to wait a moment, I'll be right out." Lu Mingho chuckled. "Liang Qichao, you are actually going to fetch a swindler personally? You're really getting worse as you live." Liang Qichao snorted and said, "I can't be bothered to tell you." He hurried toward the door. Luwen called out, "Come, come. Everyone have some tea." He acted like he was the master. Xia Ruofei waited at the security booth for 2 minutes before he saw Liang Qichao walk out hurriedly. When Liang Qichao saw Xia Ruofei, he was stunned as well. He did not expect Master Bloodwolf to be so young. He was in a daze for a moment before asking in an uncertain tone, "You are Bloodwolf?" Xia Ruofei smiled and nodded. "You must be cold-stirred meat, right? Master Bloodwolf. It's really you." Liang Qichao immediately extended both his hands enthusiastically and said, "Nice to meet you. I didn't expect you to be so young." Xia Ruofei smiled faintly and said, "My name is Xia Ruofei. May I know your name? We should call each other by our names when we are meeting face to face. It feels weird to call you by your ID." Liang Qichao laughed and said, "My surname is Liang, and my name is Liang Qichao." "Liang Qichao," Xia Ruofei repeated subconsciously. Liang Qichao laughed and said, "I knew you would misunderstand. My qi means tidy, not start up. I have another close friend called Kong Yu too. Our fathers are good friends, and they both worship the two reform pioneers, so they gave their children such names. We have to explain it every time we introduce ourselves." Xia Ruofei smiled and said, "The name is pretty good. At least it's easier to remember." He could tell that Liang Qichao was an extroverted person with a straightforward personality. Xia Ruofei had a good first impression of him. Then Xia Ruofei smiled and said, "Director Liang, I brought that ice lantern. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Please come in." Liang Qichao said impatiently, "Let's talk in my office." The two of them walked into the Immortal Succulent store. Along the way, Xia Ruofei saw the neat rows of greenhouses on both sides. From time to time, workers would come in and out. They would greet Liang Qichao respectfully when they saw him. It was obvious that the farm was not small, and it was well managed. Liang Qichao led Xia Ruofei through the greenhouse and arrived at the 3-story building. He quickly led the way and soon arrived at the office on the 3rd floor. "Mr. Xia, I have a few friends who are also succulent lovers. They also want to see your supreme-grade ice lantern." Liang Qichao asked carefully, "You don't mind, do you?" Xia Ruofei smiled and said, "Of course not. That's good, that's good." Liang Qichao was overjoyed. When they arrived at the entrance of the large office on the 3rd floor, Liang Qichao made an inviting gesture and said, "Mr. Xia, please come in." As soon as Xia Ruofei walked into the office, a few gazes landed on him. However, he was someone who had experienced all sorts of big scenes, so he was not reserved at all. He continued walking alongside Liang Qichao with his usual expression. Ling Qingxue's eyes widened when she saw Xia Ruofei. She rubbed her eyes and exclaimed in surprise, "Xia Ruofei." This was the first time Liang Qichao and the other rich second-generation heirs had seen Ling Qingxue so infatuated. They were all dumbstruck. Was this still the legendary goddess of ice? Was this still the little princess of Lingji, whose smile could not be bought with money? Why did she look like a little fan meeting a big star now? Am I dreaming? Xia Ruofei was still in a daze. Lu Mingho, who was beside, had a dark look in his eyes as he asked, "Qingxue, do you know this young man?" Ling Qingxue ignored Lu Mingho and came to Xia Ruofei excitedly. "Xia Ruofei, don't you remember me? I'm Ling Qingxue, your middle school classmate." Middle school classmate? Not only did Liang Qichao, Lu Mingho, Lu Wan, and Lu Ping find it unbelievable, even Xia Ruofei was completely dumbfounded. After a while, he said, I have some impression. You remember? Ling Qingxue said happily. That's great. I thought you really forgot about me. As she spoke, Ling Qingxue's entire body was almost touching Xia Ruofei's body. Her towering breasts were so close to Xia Ruofei's chest that Xia Ruofei took half a step back unnaturally. Liang Qichao and the rest could not help but change their view of the world once again. The cold Ling Qingxue actually had such a side to her, and just now, Xia Ruofei obviously did not remember her. He said it casually, but Ling Qingxue actually believed it. When did this little princess of Lingji, who had always been known for her intelligence and calmness, become a complete love-struck fool? Liang Qichao and the rest, including Xia Ruofei, did not know that Ling Qingxue was actually a student from the class next to Xia Ruofei's in junior high school. Xia Ruofei was considered an influential figure in junior high. He played football especially well and was considered handsome and bright. There were many girls who liked him. Ling Qingxue was one of them. Most importantly, Ling Qingxue was harassed by a group of hooligans near the school gate when she was in the second year of junior high school. It was Xia Ruofei who rushed forward and beat the hooligans away. From that moment on, Xia Ruofei's figure was deeply engraved in Ling Qingxue's heart. Of course, that incident was insignificant to Xia Ruofei. He had forgotten about it not long after. When they were in high school, Ling Xiaotian, whose business was getting bigger, arranged for Ling Qingxue to enter a high school while Xia Ruofei entered an ordinary high school. From then on, the two of them never crossed paths again. However, Ling Qingxue could not forget Xia Ruofei. The first awakening of love was the most unforgettable. Ling Qingxue even secretly went to Xia Ruofei's school to watch him play soccer. But Xia Ruofei was completely unaware of all this. Later, Ling Qingxue heard that Xia Ruofei became a soldier after graduating from high school. After that, Ling Qingxue lost all news of Xia Ruofei. In these past few years, she had quite a few suitors, especially as her father's business grew bigger and bigger, and there were more and more outstanding young men and handsome men by her side. However, not a single one of them caught her eye. It was even to the extent that she was even more annoyed by such pursuits, and her attitude became colder and colder. Ling Qingxue did not expect to be reunited with Xia Ruofei under such circumstances. In her excitement, she seemed to have become that innocent and naive middle school girl again. When she saw the prince charming in her dreams, her joy was overflowing. Xia Ruofei, I heard that you joined the army after graduating from high school. What happened after that? Ling Qingxue asked. I just retired not long ago, Xia Ruofei said. Xia Ruofei had no impression of this passionate beauty. The current situation was really awkward. Ling Qingxue didn't notice at all and continued to ask with interest. Life in the army must be exciting, right? It's all right. Xia Ruofei smiled awkwardly. It's just exercise, training, and learning. Then where do you work now that you're retired from the army? Ling Qingxue raised her head and asked with a pair of beautiful eyes. I just came back not long ago. I don't have a job yet, Xia Ruofei answered honestly. Lu Mingho could not help but say, It's not easy to find a job for soldiers nowadays. My dad's company hired someone who used to be the head of the army a few days ago. He chose to be a freelancer and is now the head of our company's office. Oh right, little Xia. What is your ranking in the army? Xia Ruofei smiled faintly and said, Sergeant. So he's not an officer. Then it's even harder to find a job, Lu Mingho said. He even glanced at Ling Qingxue, and his words were filled with a sense of superiority. Ling Qingxue did not even look at Lu Mingho. All her attention was on Xia Ruofei. Ling Qingxue said, Xia Ruofei, why don't you come to our Lingji's restaurant chain? We have a new branch in the Bell Tower area, and we are lacking a manager. Qingxue, the position of manager is so important, and little Xia doesn't have any experience in the food industry. I'm afraid it's not appropriate, Lu Wen said with a smile. None of your business, Ling Qingxue mercilessly retorted. Lu Wen looked at Xia Ruofei resentfully, pouted, and said sarcastically, Little Xia, you have to know your place. Don't try to take advantage of others. Ling Qingxue said with a cold expression. Lu Wen, don't blame me for falling out with you if you keep nagging. Who do you think you are? Who are you to interfere with our Lingji restaurant's matters? Qingxue, I'm doing this for your own good, Lu Wen explained. Xia Ruofei hurriedly said, My classmate Ling. Qingxue, I appreciate your kindness. Actually, I don't have any plans to come out to work yet. Ah, I see. Ling Qingxue was very disappointed. Then if you want to find a job, you must consider our place. The door to Ling Ji's restaurant will always be open for you. Xia Ruofei smiled bitterly. Definitely, definitely. At this moment, Liang Qichao finally had a chance to interject. He quickly said, Blood. Mr. Xia, can you show us your ice lantern jade dew? Compared to Lu Mingho and Lu Wen, Liang Qichao was much more polite to Xia Ruofei. Xia Ruofei smiled and said, Of course. Lu Mingho laughed and said, Liang Qichao, do you really believe that little Xia can cultivate a supreme-grade ice lantern? Haven't you heard? He just retired from the army. Could it be that little Xia majored in succulent plants cultivation? Haha. Lu Wen took the opportunity to quip. I think young Master Liang is going crazy trying to please others. Xia Ruofei frowned. Ever since he entered the room, Lu Mingho and Lu Wen had been targeting him. He had never met them before. Were they mad dogs? At this moment, Ling Qingxue frowned and said, Lu Mingho, Lu Wen, be more polite. Why can't Xia Ruofei nurture a supreme-grade ice lantern? Just because you can't doesn't mean others can't. Xia Ruofei was her idol when she was young and the prince charming in her heart. Furthermore, this time, when she reunited with Xia Ruofei, she realized that Xia Ruofei, who had been through military training, seemed to have a more manly aura. It simply fascinated her. How could she allow Lu Mingho and Lu Wen continue to mock Xia Ruofei? Lu Mingho and Lu Wen both shrugged and shut their mouths. However, their expressions were still filled with mockery. Xia Ruofei looked at Ling Qingxue thoughtfully. He could roughly guess what was going on. He smiled bitterly and decided not to stoop to the level of those two mad dogs. He opened the plastic bag and took out the pot of ice lantern jade dew. Seeing this, Lu Mingho could not help but mock. This is the first time I've seen someone put a supreme-grade ice lantern in a plastic bag. Haha. And this flower pot, it's too shabby. He was only focused on mocking, but he didn't realize that Liang Qichao, Ling Qingxue, and Lu Ping were completely attracted by the pot of ice lantern jade dew. They didn't even hear what he said. Liang Qichao's gaze was a little too focused, and he revealed an extremely fanatical expression. He immediately threw himself in front of the coffee table, squatted down, and stared fixedly at the ice lantern jade dew. It's too beautiful. It's simply the work of the creator, Liang Qichao muttered. This shape, these leaves, is too perfect. Liang Qichao didn't hide his fondness for this ice lantern jade dew at all. Although Ling Qingxue didn't say anything, her beautiful eyes also flickered with a loving light. She stared intensely at the pot of jade dew. The crystal clear dew reflected an enchanting light under the sunlight. Ling Qingxue's beautiful face became even more alluring. Lu Mingho finally reacted. He stared at the ice lantern jade dew and muttered, how is this possible? Lu Wen was also dumbfounded. After a while, he said with uncertainty, This can't be dyed, right? This ice lantern jade dew was truly too beautiful. It was so beautiful that it seemed like a fake. It was like a work of art. Liang Qichao, Lu Ping, and Ling Qingxue raised their heads in unison and said, Nonsense. Ling Qingxue snorted. Don't talk nonsense if you don't know anything. This is obviously an extremely rare mutated supreme-grade ice lantern. Lu Ping shook his head and said, Lu Wen, from my experience, there's nothing wrong with this ice lantern jade dew. It's even prettier than the pictures on the internet. Because of Ling Qingxue, these people had done some research on succulent plants. Liang Qichao even opened a succulent plant cultivation base. In fact, Lu Wan had a vague feeling that the ice lantern jade do wasn't fake. However, he couldn't help but say those words out of indignation. He hadn't expected to incur public wrath. Xia Ruofei did not take it to heart. There was still a faint smile on his face. At that moment, Lu Mingho looked at Xia Ruofei, then at Ling Qingxue. His eyes darted around as he said, "Little Xia, you're selling this ice lantern, right? How about this? I'll offer 80,000 yuan. Sell it to me. A pot of succulent plant for 80,000 yuan. You've earned a lot. You've been a soldier for so many years, but your retirement fee is probably not even that much." Liang Qichao immediately jumped up and said, "Lu Mingho, what do you mean? I was the one who contacted Mr. Xia. If he is going to make a deal, he will have to do it with me." Lu Ping also said, "Lu Mingho, you're a little unreasonable. How dare you give a price of 80,000 yuan? This is just the price of an ordinary supreme-grade ice lantern. The one that Mr. Xia has is a mutated variant. How about this? I'll offer 100,000 yuan. Mr. Xia, are you willing to part with it?" Lu Ping seemed soft-spoken, but how could these rich second-generation heirs be simple? His words also mocked Lu Mingho, and he pretended not to hear Liang Qichao's words, still preparing to fight for the ice lantern. Lu Mingho was furious. "I'll pay 120,000. 130,000. Sell it to me." Lu Wan also joined in the fun. These people wanted to buy this pot of ice lantern jade, due for Ling Qingxue to win her favor, so they naturally wouldn't back down. And this supreme-grade ice lantern, in fact, was worth this price. "You guys are too shameless," Liang Qichao shouted. Then he looked at Xia Ruofei pitifully and said, "Mr. Xia, Master Bloodwolf, you promised to sell it to me." Before Xia Ruofei could speak, Ling Qingxue spoke first. 1 million. I want this ice lantern. Who wants to fight with me?" Liang Qichao and the rest were dumbfounded, while Xia Ruofei did not know whether to laugh or cry. Before he came, he had roughly checked the price. Although a supreme-grade mutated ice lantern was valuable, it was definitely not worth as much as 1 million. It was not even 1/5 of 1 million. Ling Qingxue's bid was clearly not only because she liked the ice lantern. In reality, when Ling Qingxue saw that Xia Ruofei's outfit added up to less than 200 yuan, and that he had just retired from the army and had no job, it could be said that he was in dire straits. Hence, she thought of helping Xia Ruofei. However, smart as she was, she knew that she had to take into account a man's pride, and was considering how to get the best of both worlds. Then Xia Ruofei took out this pot of jade dew and prepared to sell it. Thus, Ling Qingxue did not even think about it and gave an exaggerated price. Lu Mingho quickly said, "Qingxue, no matter how good this ice lantern jade dew is, it's not worth 1 million. I know you like this pot of jade dew. I'll buy it for you later." Lu Ping adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and said, "Qingxue, this price is too high." Ling Qingxue snorted, "I like it and I'm willing. It's hard to buy my favorite thing with money. What can you do about it?" Liang Qichao did not expect things to turn out this way. He could not help but look at Xia Ruofei pleadingly. Xia Ruofei's gaze was like a torch, and he had already seen the situation clearly. Furthermore, he more or less understood Ling Qingxue's thoughts. However, Xia Ruofei could only appreciate her good intentions. He had no impression of Ling Qingxue at all. How could he accept such a large sum of money? To put it nicely, it was called cheating her feelings. To put it bluntly, it was the act of a gigolo who was living off a woman. Xia Ruofei thought about it and said, "Director Liang, since everyone is so enthusiastic, let's bid. The highest bidder wins, fair and just." However, at this point, Xia Ruofei looked at Ling Qingxue and smiled. "My classmate Ling Qingxue shall not participate in the bidding." At first, Liang Qichao thought that Xia Ruofei's words were as good as not saying anything. Ling Qingxue had already offered 1 million. How was he going to bid? Besides, who would dare to bid against Ling Qingxue? Fortunately, Xia Ruofei added the sentence afterwards, and Liang Qichao's worries turned into joy. However, Ling Qingxue could not take it. She pouted and said to Xia Ruofei, "Why can't I bid? It's not fair." Liang Qichao and the others couldn't help but stare blankly. They had known Ling Qingxue for so long, but this was the first time they had seen her reveal such a feminine side. They couldn't help but feel envious and jealous. Lu Mingho and Lu Wan were especially furious. Xia Ruofei looked at Ling Qingxue helplessly and said, "Stop fooling around. I'm doing something serious. If you like succulent plants, I'll find you another one." Ling Qingxue immediately became happy. "Then you have to keep your word." Definitely, Xia Ruofei said half-heartedly. Lu Mingho couldn't stand it anymore and quickly said, "Since that's the case, let's start bidding. Little Lu will bid 130,000, right? I'll bid 150,000. Lu Mingho added another 20,000 yuan. In fact, this price was already considered very high. The rare ice lanterns on the market were only worth about 100,000. 160,000. Lu Ping gritted his teeth and added 10,000 yuan. 170,000. Liang Qichao was not to be outdone. He was the owner of this place, and he had not made a bid just now. Lu Ping shrugged and said, "I quit." He had always been a calm person. Now that the price had exceeded the actual value of this ice lantern, he decisively chose to stop. The money of these rich second-generation heirs didn't come from nowhere. Their fathers were indeed billionaires. However, they didn't have any businesses on their own. Basically, they were living on their monthly allowance. If they took out a few 100,000 or 200,000 yuan at once, they would have a hard time surviving the month. Lu Wan thought about it and shook his head. Lu Mingho sneered and said, 180,000. He wasn't on good terms with Liang Qichao, and the two families were competing with each other for enterprises, so he had the intention to fight. Liang Qichao snorted and said, "Then I'll pay 200,000. Lu Mingho's expression changed slightly as he said angrily, "Liang Qichao, are you crazy? This ice lantern isn't worth that much money at all. Are you just bent on competing with me? Am I crazy to bid higher than you?" Liang Qichao said disdainfully, "Qingxue even offered 1,000,000 just now." Lu Mingho was shocked and quickly looked at Ling Qingxue. As expected, Ling Qingxue's expression had turned a little ugly. He hurriedly explained, "Qingxue, that's not what I meant." Ling Qingxue said coldly, "If you want to buy it, then continue bidding. If you can't afford it, then give up. Why are you talking so much nonsense?" This was intolerable. What was the most important thing in front of the woman he liked? Of course, it was the dignity of a man. Tens of thousands was nothing. Lu Mingho shouted with bloodshot eyes, as if he had been injected with chicken blood. 250,000. I bid 250,000. Liang Qichao, do you still dare to raise the bid? Xia Ruofei knew that Ling Qingxue was purposely trying to arouse Lu Mingho's competitive spirit, so that he could sell his ice lantern jade due for more money. He did not expect Lu Mingho to be so cooperative, and foolishly increased the price by 50,000 yuan. Xia Ruofei looked at Ling Qingxue reproachfully. Ling Qingxue blinked at Xia Ruofei as if they were telepathic, revealing a mischievous look. Liang Qichao was also beginning to feel troubled. This price was at least twice the actual value. It would be unwise to raise the price further, but the issue of face was also very important. At that moment, Liang Qichao saw Xia Ruofei secretly giving him a look, so he quickly came back to his senses. He laughed and said, "Lu Mingho, a gentleman doesn't take what others like. Since you like this pot of ice lantern jade, do so much that you're willing to pay twice the price. I'll fulfill your wish." With that, Liang Qichao shrugged his shoulders, indicating that he had given up the competition. Lu Mingho also calmed down, and he couldn't help but feel a trace of regret. This amount of money could buy a lot of precious succulent plants. Then Ling Qingxue said, "Since no one is bidding anymore, Lu Mingho, pay up." I didn't bring so much cash." Lu Mingho said hesitantly. "I have a payment machine here." Liang Qichao laughed. "If you swipe your card here, I'll get the finance department to transfer the money to Mr. Xia's account." Lu Mingho knew that it was impossible to go back on the payment, so he could only take out his card resentfully and watch Liang Qichao transfer 250,000 yuan. Liang Qichao asked for the card number from Xia Ruofei and walked out of the office to look for the financial personnel at the store. After a while, the finance personnel transferred 250,000 yuan into Xia Ruofei's account. "Thank you, Director Liang," Xia Ruofei said. "Haha, you're welcome." Liang Qichao laughed heartily. It's a pity that I didn't buy this supreme-grade ice lantern this time. I hope we can still work together in the future. Of course, Xia Ruofei said with a smile. Among these rich second-generation heirs, other than Lu Wan and Lu Mingho, who kept making things difficult for him, Liang Qichao and Lu Ping were still not bad. Ling Qingxue, on the other hand, looked at him with stars in her eyes. Lu Mingho looked at Xia Ruofei and Liang Qichao, who were chatting happily, and felt as if he had eaten a fly. His eyes fell on the bowl of ice lantern jade, due that he spent 250,000 to buy. His eyes suddenly lit up, and he quickly brought it to Ling Qingxue. Qingxue, this supreme-grade ice lantern is for you. I hope you like it. Ling Qingxue coldly glanced at the jade dew and said, If I want it, won't I buy it myself? I appreciate your kindness, but keep it for yourself. Initially, although Ling Qingxue had a cold personality, at least she spoke appropriately. However, when she saw Lu Mingho targeting Xia Ruofei, she did not hold back. Lu Mingho was stunned. He spent half a month's pocket money to buy this thing to win the hearts of this beauty. How could it be like this? Didn't he become a fool then? Xia Ruofei laughed and said, Director Liang, since the transaction is completed, I won't disturb you any further. I'll take my leave first. I'll send you off. Liang Qichao said hurriedly. No need. You should accompany your friends. I can go out myself, Xia Ruofei said. Then he gave Liang Qichao a look and said, I'll contact you later. Liang Qichao immediately understood and nodded. Hence, Xia Ruofei walked towards the door. Ling Qingxue suddenly spoke. Ruofei, I have to go back too. Let me send you back. With that, Ling Qingxue strode towards Xia Ruofei, leaving Liang Qichao and the rest looking at each other. Lu Mingho's expression was the ugliest. At the entrance of the Immortal Succulent store, Xia Ruofei said helplessly, My dear classmate Ling Qingxue, I still have matters to attend to, so I shan't trouble you to send me off. Ling Qingxue smiled and asked, What matters are you attending to? Of course I'm going to the bank to check the transactions. Xia Ruofei said, This is the first time I've earned so much money. How can I feel reassured if I did not check? Xia Ruofei purposely put on an unscrupulous look. Unexpectedly, Ling Qingxue did not show any disgust. Instead, her eyes lit up as she said, I happen to be going to the bank to settle some matters too. We're heading in the same direction. You should take my car. Xia Ruofei could only smile bitterly and nod. He was not a blockhead and could naturally tell Ling Qingxue's feelings. However, he had no impression of this beautiful girl at all. Moreover, he had contracted a terminal illness, so he did not want to have any more emotional entanglements. However, Ling Qingxue was so proactive that Xia Ruofei could not bear to reject her. Soon, Ling Qingxue drove the latest Porsche 911 sports car over and smiled at Xia Ruofei. Get in. The Porsche 911 sped through the streets of Three Mountain City like an orange bolt of lightning, attracting many attention along the way. In the car, Ling Qingxue kept looking for a topic to chat with Xia Ruofei about. Xia Ruofei could only reply casually to each sentence she said, making the atmosphere a little awkward. Actually, Xia Ruofei's mind was not on Ling Qingxue at all. His mind was spinning nonstop as he thought about his next step of plan. Xia Ruofei already had a basic plan in his mind, which was to cultivate the succulent plants. Succulent plants had always been popular in Japan and Korea. Perhaps it was due to their cute appearance that attracted people, or perhaps it was due to the intentional hype by the merchants. But in any case, succulent plants had inexplicably become popular in China these few years. The price of many succulent plants rose as well. Since Xia Ruofei had a killer tool, like the spiritual map space in his hands, his money path to cultivating succulent plants must be very bright. Xia Ruofei had initially decided to sell the seedlings of the succulent plants. This was mainly out of safety considerations. Even though the spiritual map space was in his hands, and it was not difficult for Xia Ruofei to cultivate the plants to their mature form, everyone knew that the growth period of succulent plants was very long. If he sold a large number of mature and rare succulent plants, it would definitely attract the attention of people and cause unnecessary trouble. Comparatively speaking, it was much safer to sell the seedlings. There were also quite a number of businesses on the internet that do the same, but the quality of their seedlings was not always great. As for the sales model, Xiao Ruofei planned to rely on online platforms. Now that e-commerce was so advanced, people's shopping habits had already changed. Moreover, most succulent plants grew well in shade and dry environment, so long-distance transportation was not a problem. Furthermore, the quality of the products would definitely be very high. Xiao Ruofei was confident that he could create a well-known e-commerce brand. It was not impossible for him to monopolize the market of high-end succulent plants. Of course, the most important thing was that he could conceal the fact that he didn't have a piece of land or a large shed, yet he was able to cultivate many rare succulent seedlings. If he had to do transactions in real life, it would be very difficult to cover it up. Instead, if he was doing online sales, these troubles could be avoided. Looks like I'll have to research how to open a shop online when I get back, Xiao Ruofei thought to himself. Ling Qingxue, who was driving, suddenly asked, "Actually, you don't remember me at all just now, right?" As he thought about his own matters and dealt with Ling Qingxue, Xiao Ruofei was naturally distracted. Hence, Xiao Ruofei nodded subconsciously and said, "Yeah." After he said that, Xiao Ruofei finally reacted to it and turned to look at Ling Qingxue awkwardly. How did you know?" Ling Qingxue smiled and said, "I'm not stupid, how could I not tell?" After saying that, Ling Qingxue smiled sweetly again. With one hand on the steering wheel and the other reaching out to Xiao Ruofei, she said, "Let's get to know each other again. My name is Ling Qingxue, and I graduated from Three Mountain City No. 2 High School. I'm now the financial manager of the Ling Ji restaurant chain." Three Mountain City No. 2 High School was both Ling Qingxue and Xiao Ruofei's alma mater. It was when Ling Qingxue was studying at No. 2 High School that the seed of love sprouted in her heart and Xiao Ruofei's figure was engraved in her mind. Xiao Ruofei reached out to shake Ling Qingxue's hand and smiled. "This is the first time I've heard someone introduce herself with her high school." Ling Qingxue playfully stuck out her tongue and smiled. "Isn't this to remind you of the past?" After she made a small joke, Xiao Ruofei was not as awkward as before. His mind did not wander off again, and he started chatting with Ling Qingxue. Even though Xiao Ruofei did not have any other intentions, her beauty was still very pleasing to the eye. It was precisely because Xiao Ruofei's thoughts were pure that he did not feel pressured by the difference in wealth and status between the two of them. He had always been very calm. Unexpectedly, this made Ling Qingxue award additional impression points to him. Soon, the car arrived at the bank. Xiao Ruofei opened the car door and got out. He turned around and said, "Qingxue, thank you for sending me here. Goodbye." "Oh, right, Mr. Xia. Why have you returned to look for me? Could it be that you still have some 1148 high-quality succulents like the ice lantern jade due for sale?" After saying that, Xiao Ruofei prepared to walk into the bank. Ling Qingxue quickly stopped him. "Ruofei, we haven't seen each other for so many years. Shall we find a place to catch up later? I really have something on today. Let's find another chance next time," Xiao Ruofei said. It was the hardest to accept a beauty's kindness. Xiao Ruofei practically ran into the bank. Ling Qingxue looked at Xiao Ruofei's retreating figure and could not help but laugh. Then she wrinkled her nose and said, "This time God let me meet you again. Don't think of running away from me again." Ling Qingxue then stepped on the accelerator and drove the Porsche 911 away from the bank. After driving a few meters away, Ling Qingxue patted her forehead and muttered to herself, "Aya, I can't believe that I forgot to ask him for his phone number. Liang Qichao definitely has it. I'll get it from him." Recalling how awkward Xiao Ruofei was when she exposed his lie, Ling Qingxue could not help but burst into laughter. Her pretty face looked even more radiant. Through the glass window of the bank, Xiao Ruofei saw Ling Qingxue's car drive away. He let out a long sigh of relief and walked out of the bank quickly. He just made up a lame excuse to check his accounts. He had set an automatic notification from the bank, so he had received a text message when the transaction was made earlier. An hour later, Xiao Ruofei appeared at the Immortal Succulent store again. The moment he entered Liang Qichao's office, Xiao Ruofei looked around subconsciously. Liang Qichao could not help but laugh. "Don't worry, Ling Ji's little princess has already left. Lu Mingho and the rest also left not long after you left." Xiao Ruofei heaved a sigh of relief and smiled sheepishly. Liang Qichao hesitated and said, "But, Mr. Xia, Qingxue called to ask for your contact number. I didn't ask for your permission before giving her your number. I'm really sorry. I really can't reject her request." Xiao Ruofei smiled and waved his hand. "It's okay. Since she wants to obtain my number, even if you don't give it to her, she can still find it. It's good that you don't mind." Liang Qichao heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he asked with a hint of anticipation, "Oh right, Mr. Xia. Why have you returned to Look FO Army? Could it be that you still have some high-quality succulents like the Ice Lantern Jade due for sale?" Xiao Ruofei smiled and said, "There are so many types of succulents that Director Liang likes. How can it be so easy to find? But I have a friend who has connections in this area. If you give me some time, it should be no problem." Xiao Ruofei was already planning to cultivate the seedlings of succulents. He would definitely not lack any succulent plants in the future. When the time came, he would pick 1 or 2 pots to cultivate into mature plants and sell them to Liang Qichao. But to Liang Qichao, these words had a different meaning. Other than cultivating themselves, there were also other ways to import succulent plants from overseas. Many of the rare succulent plants did not originate from Huaxia, but due to environmental concerns, their imports were forbidden. Hence, Liang Qichao mistakenly thought that Xiao Ruofei had the means to get good stuff from overseas. Therefore, he was overjoyed when he heard that. Thank you. Thank you. I knew that when you stopped me from bidding with Lu Mingho, you must have a way to get more succulents of this grade. Mr. Xia, I'll remember this favor." Haha. Letting Lu Mingho be a fool for once is better than anything else. "You're welcome," Xiao Ruofei said with a faint smile. "Director Liang, I came back today because I wanted to take a look at your greenhouse. Is it convenient now?" "Of course," Liang Qichao said readily. "I have quite a lot of experience in cultivating succulent plants. When we tour the greenhouse later, if you have any questions, feel free to ask." "Thanks." Xiao Ruofei smiled and said. Liang Qichao personally brought Xiao Ruofei down the stairs and started to tour the succulent plants cultivation base. "Director Liang, this cultivation base of yours is quite big," Xiao Ruoxin said with a smile as he walked around the shed. "Hee. It's mainly because I like this. I invested some money to build this base. Actually, it doesn't cost much." Liang Qichao laughed casually. Xiao Ruofei could tell that he was obviously a rich second-generation heir. He probably ran this store for fun. Liang Qichao continued to speak. "By the way, stop calling me Director Liang. I'm just a few years older than you. If you don't mind, call me Brother Liang. I'll call you Ruofei." Xiao Ruofei had a good impression of the straightforward Liang Qichao. He followed his advice and said, "Sure, Brother Liang." Liang Qichao beamed. "Hey, Ruofei, I don't have anything else here, but I do have a lot of succulent plants. If you see anything you like later, feel free to tell me. Take it as a gift from Brother Liang." "Okay." Xiao Ruofei did not stand on ceremony with Liang Qichao and nodded. As the two of them walked forward, Liang Qichao introduced to him eagerly. "Ruofei, one of the big sheds here is filled with jade fans. The one next to the big shed is planted with lifestone flowers. There are also some tortoiseshell peonies over there, but the quantity isn't large. This one is too hard to get. And over here, it's mainly used to cultivate jade dew, but they are all ordinary plants. They can't compare to your supreme-grade ice lantern." Xiao Ruofei looked at them seriously, especially when some workers were caring for the plants. He would stop by the side to watch and ask questions about planting. Liang Qichao was a succulent plant lover, so he was naturally not annoyed by Xiao Ruofei's questions. He patiently explained everything to him. Xiao Ruofei kept all the information regarding planting and nurturing the succulents in mind. "Brother Liang, the variety of succulent plants here is really diverse," Xiao Ruofei said with a smile. Then he raised his question. "But why are all these succulent plants so small? Can they be sold for a good price?" Liang Qichao smiled bitterly and explained. "Brother, succulents plants are famous for growing slowly. If my cultivation base is filled with succulents as big as your ice lantern, won't I be rich? Good quality mature plants are hard to come by. We usually use them to breed other seedlings. In fact, we mainly sell succulent plant seedlings. Xiao Ruofei nodded his head secretly. Liang Qichao's answer was similar to what he had expected. It seemed like he had made the right decision to sell high-quality succulent plant seedlings. The two of them chatted as they toured the place. Xiao Ruofei gained a rough understanding of the growth and reproduction of the succulent plants, and the plan he came up with on Ling Qingshua's car gradually became more concrete. The Immortal Succulent store was not small. In addition, Xiao Ruofei would stop to ask questions from time to time. Hence, after touring the place one round, 2 hours had passed. Seeing that it was almost time for dinner, Liang Qichao enthusiastically invited Xiao Ruofei for dinner, but Xiao Ruofei politely declined his offer. The two of them bade farewell at the entrance of the store. As Xiao Ruoxin got into the taxi, Liang Qichao reminded him outside the window. Ruofei, the next time there's succulent plants, you must consider your brother Liang first. The price is not a problem. It seemed that Liang Qichao was still a little upset that he did not manage to buy the supreme-grade ice lantern this time. Xiao Ruofei smiled and nodded. He waved at Liang Qichao, and the taxi drove away from the store. Xiao Ruofei alighted from the car near the shantytown. Then he found a random noodle shop by the roadside and ordered a big bowl of beef noodles. He slurped his noodles and quickly cleared his bowl. With the training during his military career, Xiao Ruofei was not very particular about food. However, the noodles at the roadside stall did not taste good, especially the vegetables in the noodles. They were overcooked and hard and tasted like wax. After eating, Xiao Ruofei suddenly had an idea. Since the spiritual map space was so magical, why don't he plant some vegetables inside? Even if it wasn't for the sake of earning money, it would be good to improve his meals occasionally. The vegetables grown in the spiritual map space would definitely be much better than the vegetables sold in the market. At the moment, he only wanted to use the spiritual map space to cultivate the succulent plant seedlings. The amount of land in the space was more than enough. At the thought of this, Xiao Ruofei decided to take action immediately. He took a taxi to a seed company in the city and bought some common vegetable seeds. At the same time, he also bought some common farm tools. Xiao Ruofei had been in charge of the team's vegetable fields when he was a new recruit, so it was not difficult for him to grow vegetables. After bringing the seeds and farming tools into the spiritual map space, Xiao Ruofei dug up a small vegetable patch beside the pool. The soil in the space was very soft, and Xiao Ruofei quickly finished the reclamation work. After soaking the seed in the water from the spiritual pond, Xiao Ruofei returned to the outside world to rest for a while. After a few hours, he entered the space to Cao. As for the rest, he basically didn't have to do anything, because he believed that after soaking the seeds in the spiritual pond water, the chances of them germinating would definitely be extremely high. Moreover, he didn't have to worry about any harmful bugs. Xiao Ruofei sprinkled the seeds evenly while covering the ground with a layer of soil. After he was done, he used the spiritual pond water to water all the vegetable fields. After he was done, Xiao Ruofei looked at the newly planted vegetable field with a sense of accomplishment and left the spiritual map space in satisfaction. After showering, Xiao Ruofei slept for 2 hours before waking up at 10 in the evening to enter the spiritual map space again. Actually, he only wanted to drink some water from the spiritual pool because his mouth was dry after waking up. However, once he entered the space, Xiao Ruofei's eyes were immediately attracted by the patch of green that came into view. The greenery came from the vegetable field beside the pond. Xiao Ruofei was pleasantly surprised to find that in just 2 hours, all the vegetable seeds had sprouted. Some of them had even grown to the length of a finger. The tender green leaves were filled with vitality. The magic within the spiritual map space shocked Xiao Ruoxi once again. In just 2 hours, the plants had sprouted and even grew so much. This completely overturned the science of plant growth. After thinking for a long time, Xiao Ruofei suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He thought of a possibility, and his face was filled with excitement. To verify his conjecture, Xiao Ruofei left the spiritual map space in a flash. He picked up a small alarm clock by his bed and immediately returned to the space. He glanced at the time displayed on the small alarm clock. It was 6:23 p.m. He took note of this time in his heart. Then, Xiao Ruofei placed the small alarm clock gently on the ground and left the spiritual map space quickly. Once he returned to the outside world, Xiao Ruofei immediately took out his counterfeit phone, switched to the stopwatch, and started the timer. Then, Xiao Ruofei sat by the bed with a hint of anticipation and nervousness as he waited. He looked at the numbers on the stopwatch that kept jumping until 120 seconds had passed. That was 2 minutes later. With a thought, he returned to the spiritual map space. Xiao Ruofei could not wait to pick up the small alarm clock. He looked at the time on it and was instantly overjoyed. It was already 6:43 p.m. In reality, only 2 minutes had passed outside, but the small alarm clock had gone on for 20 minutes. In other words, the flow of time in this spiritual map space was 10 times slower than the outside world. When 1 day had passed in the outside world, 10 days had already passed in the spiritual map space. Therefore, although the vegetable seeds had only been planted for about 2 hours, they had spent almost an entire day in the space. In addition to the effects of the soil and the pond water in the space, and perhaps the mysterious effects of the space itself, the growth of the plants here far exceeded that of the outside world, so there was a reasonable explanation. Now that his conjecture was verified, Xiao Ruofei's mind started to work. With 10 times the flow of time, there were too many possibilities for him to work with. For example, crops that needed 2 months to grow under normal conditions in the outside world could fully mature in less than a week under the combined effects of the time acceleration, pond water, and soil. Especially when it came to Xiao Ruofei's next step of succulent plant cultivation, the effects were even more obvious. This was because succulent plants were known for growing slowly. Of course, there were other uses as well. For example, Xiao Ruofei could enter the spiritual map space to rest. If he had 8 hours of sleep, less than 1 hour would have passed in the outside world. That way, he would have more time to do other things. Xiao Ruofei thought happily for a while. After he calmed down a little, he walked to the pond and drank a few mouthfuls of water. He felt instantly refreshed. He admired the strange blue, yellow, and red flowers growing from the unknown plant by the pond. This flower seemed to have a special charm. Every time Xiao Ruofei entered the space, his gaze would involuntarily be attracted. He was also used to admiring this flower every time he came in. After appreciating the flowers, Xiao Ruofei left the spiritual map space. He carefully hid the spiritual map close to his body. This was his most important treasure. Whether he could earn enough money for Hu Zi's mother to get a kidney transplant, follow-up care, and recovery fees, it would all depend on the map. The night passed. The next morning, Xiao Ruofei hid the spiritual map on himself, locked the door, and left the rental apartment. He walked to the Three Mountain Plaza, which was not far from the shanty town. Before he carried out his plan to get rich, he still had some preparation work to do. The Three Mountain Plaza was a very large city complex. All the basic necessities of life could be found there. Xiao Ruofei first found a cell phone store and bought a smartphone that cost about 1,000 yuan. Even though he earned over 200,000 yuan in one go, Xiao Ruofei still maintained his habit of being thrifty. Furthermore, he still had a lot of costs to cover, and it was not the time to spend extravagantly. After buying the phone, he also paid for a new number. At this time, the number was not tagged to a name yet, so Xiao Ruofei easily bought a phone card. It was not cheap, but this number would only be used for a short period of time, so Xiao Ruofei did not pay much attention to it. Then, he went to a nearby bank to apply for a new card and transferred 100,000 yuan into his bank account. He also activated online transactions and other functions. After settling the matters, Xiao Ruofei wandered around the vicinity and memorized the locations of the delivery sites near the shantytown. Just like that, the morning passed. Xiao Ruofei found a random place to have lunch. After he finished eating, he went home and started working on his computer. He used his new cell phone number to apply for a Taobao account and Alipay account. At the same time, he tied Alipay's new bank account with the online transaction function. Then, Xiao Ruofei started searching for succulent plant sellers on Tmall. He had been busy for half a day, all for one thing: buying a mature succulent plant. Even though Liang Qichao gave Xiao Ruofei many succulent plant seedlings before he left that day, they were all very ordinary. Obviously, They did not meet Xiaoruofei's high-end pursuit. He could not always depend on the spiritual map space to mutate all the succulent plants and produce rare species. Thus, the most reliable method was naturally to purchase the rare succulent plant seedlings, and then use the spiritual map space to allow the seedlings to mature in a relatively short period of time. Then, these rare mature plants would be used as mature plants to reproduce and sell. Xiaoruofei was a cautious person, so he specially applied for a brand new account and bought a new phone line to prevent others from finding any clues. After all, he was going to reproduce on a large scale in the near future and sell the rare succulent plant seedlings. If someone were to trace the information of his purchase of the succulent plant seedlings, they might discover something amiss and even expose the secret of the spiritual map. Hence, Xiaoruofei would rather spend a lot of effort to get a new phone number and apply for a new account to do this. The previous day at the Immortal Succulent store, Xiaoruofei had also gotten a lot of information from Liang Qichao while chatting with him, including some reputable sellers on Taobao and Tmall. Thus, he used his new account to search the shops of these merchants online and started his shopping spree. A supreme-grade jade fan, I can buy this. There's actually a pale pink mutated myriad elephant. Of course I have to get it, and I've just been waiting to get a flower of life. Xiaoruofei muttered to himself as he shopped. All of the breeds that he chose were extremely rare, so the price naturally wouldn't be cheap. In just a short while, he had spent 60,000 to 70,000 yuan. Most of the time, Xiaoruofei only chose seedlings. However, when he came across a shop selling mature plants, he also bought them. For example, a mature blooming cage that cost 20,000 yuan. After thinking for a while, Xiaoruofei decided to buy it. This was because the growth rate of succulent plants like the blooming cage was so slow that it made one's hair stand on end. Every year, they would grow by about 1 millimeter. Even with the 10 times acceleration of time in the spiritual map space and the unique advantages of the spiritual pond and soil, it would take at least several years for a seedling to grow. There were ready-made mature plants available to buy, and Xiaoruofei naturally would not let the opportunity miss. Relatively speaking, the time needed to cultivate the seedlings was still very short. Other than the blooming cage, Xiaoruofei also spent about 15,000 yuan to bid for a white-skinned moon realm. Liang Qichao was indeed a succulent plant expert. The few shops he recommended sold many rare species. Of course, he would only know the quality after receiving the goods. The after-sales guarantee online was quite good. In addition, Liang Qichao had recommended merchants with good reputation, so Xiaoruofei was not too worried. By the time the purchase was completed, Xiaoruofei had spent a total of more than 90,000 yuan to buy the seedlings of more than 10 rare varieties of succulents and 2 mature succulents. His heart ached. The speed he took to spend the amount was a little too fast. 250,000 yuan seemed like a lot, but it was still not enough. Xiaoruofei did not write the delivery address as his rental apartment in the shantytown. Instead, he chose a delivery collection point. He was extremely cautious and even chose different collection points for different merchants. In the next few days, Xiaoruofei began to busy himself with opening an online store. Considering that Tmall was mainly targeted at enterprises, not only did one have to register an enterprise on Tmall, they also had to pay a deposit and a considerable amount of technical service fee. Therefore, Xiaoruofei did not consider using Tmall directly and instead set up a Taobao shop first. Compared to Tmall, the process of opening a shop on Taobao was much simpler. However, it also required various certifications. Xiaoruofei used his old phone number as the corresponding Taobao and Alipay accounts to apply to open the shop. He uploaded his identification photo and finally managed to apply for the shop after some trouble. Then, Xiaoruofei began to perfect the information of the shop. After thinking for a long time, he named his Taobao shop Peach Garden Succulents. This name was naturally taken from peach blossom origins. In Xiaoruofei's opinion, the spiritual space in the spiritual map was like the peach blossom origins. The next step was to renovate the shop. Actually, there was nothing much to design. Xiaoruofei only chose some free templates provided and simply built the framework of the online shop. As for those fancy templates that charged money, Xiaoruofei would not spend on them. As there were no products yet, Xiaoruofei was not in a hurry. He fumbled around and slowly established the online store framework by himself. Soon 4 or 5 days had passed. During this period, Ling Qingxue called Xiaoruofei twice to ask him out for a meal, but he rejected her politely. When he heard the little girl's aggrieved voice on the phone, Xiaoruofei could not bear to see her like this. However, he was really busy, and he also had a terminal illness. He did not know how long he could live, so he could only reject her heartlessly. In the past few days, the succulents that Xiaoruofei had bought online began to arrive one after another. He also became busy. Every time he received a delivery call, he would rush over to collect it immediately. These were all extremely valuable rare succulents, and were also the seeds for him to earn big money in the future. If he lost them at the collection point, it would be too late for Xiaoruofei to cry. The first item he received was the mature plant from the white-skinned moon realm that cost Xiaoruofei 15,000 yuan. After Xiaoruofei retrieved it, he locked the door and entered the spiritual map space with the parcel. As the small potted plant was sold for 15,000 yuan, the shop owner was naturally very careful and wrapped it in well-protected packaging. When he opened the large cardboard box, the first thing Xiaoruofei saw was the foam strips that were filled to the brim. He pried open the top layer of the foam strips and saw a transparent plastic cover. A large flower pot was fixed inside, and in the flower pot was the white-skinned moon realm that was worth 15,000 yuan. It had huge fleshy roots. It looked like a big turnip, but a little harder than a turnip. Its surface was covered with a layer of wax. On the exposed fleshy roots, there were dense green leaves. Every leaf had snow-white fur. At a glance, it looked like a misty rain. It was very beautiful and dreamy. Xiaoruofei carefully took the pot of white-skinned moon realm out of the cardboard box and moved it to the side of the spiritual pond. Then, he carefully pried away the granular soil around the root and slowly pulled the white-skinned moon realm out of the flower pot. If Liang Qichao saw Xiaoruofei's actions, he would definitely reprimand him. How could he pull out such a precious supreme-grade white-skinned moon realm so roughly? Wouldn't it be a waste if the plant had died because of the large movements? There were also particular steps to take when replacing the soil for the succulent plants. Of course, a layman like Xiaoruofei would not know so much. However, Xiaoruofei naturally had a reason for doing so. At the same time, he had confidence. He carefully put the white-skinned moon realm aside, then poured all the granular soil mixture out of the flower pot. He picked up a shovel and poured some spiritual soil, mixing them evenly. Xiaoruofei believed that adding spiritual soil to the pot would definitely promote the growth of the white-skinned moon realm. As for whether such a move would cause harm to the white-skinned moon realm, Xiaoruofei was not worried at all. With the magical spiritual map space, as well as the soil and pond water, how could it not grow? As expected, when Xiaoruofei put the plant material mixed with the spiritual soil back into the flower pot, replanted the white-skinned moon realm, and watered it with the spiritual pond water, the originally listless white-skinned moon realm immediately became energetic. If Liang Qichao saw this scene, he would definitely be shocked. In the following days, Xiaoruofei kept receiving deliveries. He did the same to these succulents, be it mature plants or seedlings. After mixing some spiritual soil in the plant material, he carefully planted them in the spiritual space. For convenience's sake, he placed the flower pots with rare succulents by the spiritual pool. Out of habit, Xiaoruofei arranged these flower pots neatly. At a glance, they looked like soldiers waiting to be inspected. Moreover, the succulent plants that had been watered with the spiritual water were all growing happily and energetically. Coupled with the fact that they were all rare mutated species, they looked even more pleasing to the eye. In the following days, Xiaoruofei lived very leisurely. Every day, other than entering the spiritual space to see the growth of the succulents and admire the beautiful flowers of the mysterious plant by the pond, he basically had nothing else to do. The renovation of the online store was also constantly being perfected. Now, everything was ready except for the products to be put on sale. Considering that he needed to take some high-quality photos to open an online store, Xiaoruofei gritted his teeth and went to a digital store in the Three Mountains Plaza to buy a DSLR camera. Even though it was only an entry-level one, it still cost him more than 10,000 yuan. Soon, only half of the 250,000 yuan earned from the sale of the supreme-grade ice lantern jade dew was left. Due to the magical effects of space and the difference in the flow of time, the vegetables that Xia Ruofei had planted previously grew very quickly. For example, the mustard greens that had a shorter growth cycle were completely ripe in 3 or 4 days after they were sown and could be picked and eaten. It was worth mentioning that the vegetables grown in this spiritual space were not only much larger than those sold outside, but they also looked quite good. They were green and full of vitality. They didn't even look like real vegetables, but like works of art carved from jade. Xia Ruofei had a small induction stove in the rental apartment, so he couldn't wait to pick some mustard greens. After leaving the space, he rinsed them casually with clean water. The vegetable leaves growing in the spiritual space could be said to be spotless and very clean, then cut and stir-fried them. Xia Ruofei had received professional wilderness survival training in the army, so although his culinary skills could not be compared to a restaurant chef's, he could at least cook a plate of vegetables. Soon, a plate of stir-fried mustard greens was freshly prepared. Other than a little vegetable oil and salt, no other seasoning was added. The stir-fried mustard greens on the plate looked fresh and green, making Xia Ruofei's appetite grow. He picked up his chopsticks and put some vegetables into his mouth. Before he could chew, Xia Ruofei felt a fragrance assault his nose, making him start chewing. With a bite, the sweetness and crispness of the mustard greens made every one of his taste buds bounce in joy. Xia Ruofei took several large mouthfuls before stopping. His eyes lit up with delight. He had never eaten such delicious vegetables in his life. What was certain was that the vegetables sold on the market, including the expensive organic ones marked in supermarkets, were worlds apart from the mustard greens he had grown in the space. There was no doubt that this was the magical effect of the spirit map space. Looks like I'll always have a great meal in the future. Xia Ruofei thought of the many vegetables planted in the space and could not help but mutter to himself happily. The vegetables in the space grew extremely quickly. He definitely did not need to buy vegetables in the future. He could even take some out to sell. Compared to the growth rate of vegetables, the growth rate of the succulents seemed a little slow. Even though time was accelerated by 10 times, Xia Ruofei could only see that they had grown a little every day when he entered the space. The growth of the blooming cage and white-skinned moon realm was the slowest and could not even be seen with the naked eye. Xia Ruofei knew that succulents grew slowly, so he was not in a hurry. Xia Ruofei was not in a hurry to reproduce them, including the 2 mature blooming cages and the white-skinned moon realm. What he was hoping was that by letting them grow in the spiritual map space for a longer period of time, they could gain greatest vitality. Moreover, they might even undergo a surprising mutation like the jade dew that was sold previously. Since he had decided to take the route to selling high-end products, Xia Ruofei knew that he could not be too hasty. The days passed in a leisurely manner. In the blink of an eye, a month had passed in the outside world and 10 months had passed in the space. With the magical enhancement of the resources in the space, those succulents might even be considered to have grown in the outside world for a year or 2, or even more. In the past month, Xia Ruofei had not been idle. He had to enter the spiritual map space every day to maintain those succulent plants. As he watched the succulent plants grow at an unimaginable speed, a sense of accomplishment arose in his heart. As for the vegetables in the spiritual space, he had harvested them one after another. The quality of these vegetables far exceeded the premium organic vegetables sold outside. Be it mustard green, romaine lettuce, cabbage, or other leafy vegetables, or cucumbers, tomatoes, and so on, not only did they grow extremely fast, but they could also be harvested in 3 to 4 days. Moreover, they looked extremely good. The leaves were green and full of vitality. The pure green color even gave off an unreal feeling. The cucumbers and tomatoes were also clearly much larger than ordinary ones. Cucumbers were generally as thick as an adult's arm, and the shortest ones were 40 to 50 centimeters long. Each of the tomatoes was the size of a bowl, and the juice flowed out when bitten, sweet, and refreshing. Xia Ruofei called the vegetables he planted super vegetables. They certainly lived up to their names. Xia Ruofei naturally could not finish so many vegetables alone. Therefore, after he harvested them, He placed them in baskets and left them in the spiritual space. From this, Xiaoruofei accidentally discovered another function of the spiritual map space. After the vegetables and fruits were plucked, as long as they were stored in the spiritual map space, they would not be affected by time at all. A few days in the outside world was equivalent to dozens of days in the space, but those vegetables and fruits were still as fresh as when they were just plucked. Even more amazingly, this function only worked on plucked vegetables and fruits, and they had to be stored in a container. Xiaoruofei specially left a cabbage outside for testing and let it grow in the ground. In the end, it quickly turned yellow after its growth period. In the next day or two, it even rotted in the ground and melted into the soil. With this discovery, Xiaoruofei specially went to purchase a batch of wicker baskets and packed the harvested vegetables in time. After a month in the outside world and 10 months in the space, the succulent plants had generally grown a lot. In particular, the blooming cages and white-skinned moon realm that were originally mature plants became even more lively and looked quite energetic. The expected mutation did not happen, but since Xiaoruofei had bought rare breeds, he was not too disappointed. On this day, he decided to begin the crucial step, the first crossbreeding of the succulents. In fact, many succulents could also be sown and reproduced, but in order to save time, Xiaoruofei still chose the method of cuttage. Moreover, this method allowed for asexual reproduction and could preserve the characteristics of the previous generation of plants very well. For Xiaoruofei, who had made up his mind to produce high-quality plants, this was naturally the best choice. Some of the succulent forums mentioned that the survival rate of succulents, such as the white-skinned moon realm during cuttage, was low. However, Xiaoruofei, who had the spiritual map space, did not consider it at all. First, he lined up the small flower pots that he had already prepared. They were half filled with planting materials. Then, he walked to the largest pot with the white-skinned moon realm and slowly squatted down. Xiaoruofei flipped his hand and a dagger flashed. Anyone who knew what was going on here would be surprised. The dagger was clearly one of the top 10 military daggers in the world. The blade of this dagger was short and looked like a kitchen knife. It looked a little simple. However, there was a terrifying killing intent hidden under this plain appearance. There was also a faint coldness on the blade. It was obvious that it had been stained with blood before. Xiaoruofei looked at the dagger in his hand with a reminiscent look in his eyes. This was the reward he had obtained after killing a mercenary employed by an international drug trafficking organization during his first overseas battle. It was also the first time in his military career that he had personally killed an enemy. After that, this dagger had accompanied Xiaoruofei and experienced many battles. In many close combat battles, Xiaoruofei relied on this dagger to cleanly finish off his enemies. Looking at the dagger, Xiaoruofei said with a wry smile, "Buddy, you're supposed to be a killing blade, but now I have to use you for gardening. It's been hard on you." With that, Xiaoruofei first gestured with the dagger in the air in front of the white-skinned moon realm, then slashed down without hesitation. He was still very decisive when he swung it, and the blade was extremely stable and did not tremble at all. When his condition was not acting up, he was still the blood wolf that made his enemies tremble in fear. However, once the illness acted up, he would not even be able to hold a glass of water steadily. The dagger cut precisely along the pre-observed angle, and a piece of rhizome with dreamy leaves was cut. Xiaoruofei cut it diagonally. This way, he could increase the area of the cut surface as much as possible and increase the success rate of the cuttage. Of course, this was all information found on the internet. Xiaoruofei picked up the small piece of root that had been cut and gently inserted it face down into the small flower pot. Then, he reached out and grabbed a handful of plant material that had been mixed into the space soil and piled them around the root, gently pressing it. Then, Xiaoruofei picked up the watering can filled with water from the spiritual pond and poured it over the roots that had just been inserted. Then, Xiaoruofei did the same thing for the other plants. His movements became more and more proficient. In half a day, he had finished inserting all the succulents. There were hundreds of small flower pots neatly arranged beside him. They were all small plants that he had cut from the roots of the succulents. Xiaoruofei looked at the neat rows of small flower pots. Large amounts of money seemed to be appearing in his eyes. In the market, slightly better succulents cost hundreds of yuan, and it was very normal for rare species to cost thousands. The succulents that Xia Ruofei had inserted were all very precious and rare species. Moreover, they were cultivated from asexual reproduction and could almost perfectly replicate the characteristics of the previous generation. Coupled with the magical spiritual map space abilities, their quality would definitely be top-notch in the future. Therefore, these 100 pots of succulents were worth at least 100,000 yuan. And this was the first batch. When the mature succulents had grown back, the cuttage could continue. Furthermore, Xia Ruofei had made up his mind to leave behind some especially outstanding seedlings among the succulent seedlings to be cultivated into mature plants. This way, the scale of his succulent army could be further expanded. However, the succulents that had been cut looked rather miserable. Xia Ruofei flipped his hand and a dagger flashed. Anyone who knew what was going on here would be surprised. The dagger was clearly one of the top 10 military daggers in the world. The blade of this dagger was short and looked like a kitchen knife. It looked a little simple. However, there was a terrifying killing intent hidden under this plain appearance. There was also a faint coldness on the blade. It was obvious that it had been stained with blood before. Xia Ruofei looked at the dagger in his hand with a reminiscent look in his eyes. This was the reward he had obtained after killing a mercenary employed by an international drug trafficking organization during his first overseas battle. It was also the first time in his military career that he had personally killed an enemy. After that, this dagger had accompanied Xia Ruofei and experienced many battles. In many close combat battles, Xia Ruofei relied on this dagger to cleanly finish off his enemies. Looking at the dagger, Xia Ruofei said with a wry smile, "Buddy, you're supposed to be a killing blade, but now I have to use you for gardening. It's been hard on you." With that, Xia Ruofei first gestured with the dagger in the air in front of the white-skinned moon realm, then slashed down without hesitation. He was still very decisive when he swung it, and the blade was extremely stable and did not tremble at all. When his condition was not acting up, he was still the blood wolf that made his enemies tremble in fear. However, once the illness acted up, he would not even be able to hold a glass of water steadily. The dagger cut precisely along the pre-observed angle, and a piece of rhizome with dreamy leaves was cut. Xia Ruofei cut it diagonally. This way, he could increase the area of the cut surface as much as possible and increase the success rate of the cuttage. Of course, this was all information found on the internet. Xia Ruofei picked up the small piece of root that had been cut and gently inserted it face down into the small flower pot. Then, he reached out and grabbed a handful of plant material that had been mixed into the space soil and piled them around the root, gently pressing it. Then, Xia Ruofei picked up the watering can filled with water from the spiritual pond and poured it over the roots that had just been inserted. Then Xia Ruofei did the same thing for the other plants. His movements became more and more proficient. In half a day, he had finished inserting all the succulents. There were hundreds of small flower pots neatly arranged beside him. They were all small plants that he had cut from the roots of the succulents. Xia Ruofei looked at the neat rows of small flower pots. Large amounts of money seemed to be appearing in his eyes. In the market, slightly better succulents cost hundreds of yuan, and it was very normal for rare species to cost thousands. The succulents that Xia Ruofei had inserted were all very precious and rare species. Moreover, they were cultivated from asexual reproduction and could almost perfectly replicate the characteristics of the previous generation. Coupled with the magical spiritual map space abilities, their quality would definitely be top-notch in the future. Therefore, these 100 pots of succulents were worth at least 100,000 yuan. And this was the first batch. When the mature succulents had grown back, the cuttage could continue. Furthermore, Xia Ruofei had made up his mind to leave behind some especially outstanding seedlings among the succulent seedlings to be cultivated into mature plants. This way, the scale of his succulent army could be further expanded. However, the succulents that had been cut looked rather miserable. The originally chubby and cute plants were now covered in wounds. It was as if beautiful women with beautiful hair had been shaved by a hairdresser. Especially the pots of succulents that had been cultivated from saplings. Only a small piece was left. If it was in an ordinary environment, the mature plant would basically not be able to survive after being cut to this extent. Moreover, the success rate of inserting the seedlings was very low. The seedlings might not even survive, so it was impossible for most people to do this. However, Xiaoruofe naturally did not have such concerns. After he finished inserting, he carefully brought over the spiritual pond water and watered the mature succulent plant. At the same time, he specially sprinkled some spiritual pond water on every incision. Then he stood up with relief and rubbed his sore waist. These originally listless succulents quickly became energetic after absorbing the spiritual water. In particular, the wounds that were originally dripping with green juice were now showing signs of healing. Seeing this, Xiaoruofe was completely relieved. The spiritual map space was no longer as lifeless as before. More than 100 flower pots were neatly placed beside the small pond. They were all succulent plants, including the mature plant and the seedlings that had just been planted. Beyond that area, there was a small vegetable field with green cucumbers hanging on a shelf. There were also various vegetables and fruits planted in the field that could be harvested almost every day. Beside the vegetable field were neatly stacked baskets. There were all kinds of vegetables and fruits in them, which Xiaoruofe did not have time to finish eating. These fruits and vegetables were all the same as when they were first picked. They were very fresh, as if time had frozen on them. Of course, there was also a strange-looking plant by the pond. There was also a beautiful 3-colored flower on it that never withered. This was something that already existed in the space. Every time Xiaoruofe entered the space, he could not help but admire it for a while. The nameless flower seemed to have a magical attracting power that made Xiaoruofe involuntarily approach it. As long as Xiaoruofe stayed beside this nameless plant and looked at the beautiful flower, it was as if his heart would become extremely calm and he would be extremely relaxed. He even brought a small plastic stool into the space and placed it beside the plant. Every time he sat on the stool, he quietly admired the tricolor flower. That day, after Xiaoruofe finished his cottage work, he naturally walked towards the mysterious plant again. This was almost a compulsory task for him every time he entered the space. However, something unexpected happened that day. Just as Xiaoruofe approached the nameless plant, his feet suddenly went limp. Ever since he had Lou Gehrig's disease, Xiaoruofe had often experienced this state of weakness in his limbs. However, this time, perhaps because he had worked for too long and was caught off guard, he could not help but stagger forward. This step just happened to trip the plastic stool. Xiaoruofe lost his balance and fell towards the nameless plant. The nameless plant was only as thick as a thumb. If he landed on it, it would probably break. Xiaoruofe loved this nameless plant very much, especially that beautiful tricolor flower. Naturally, he did not want this to happen. Being well trained in the troops also allowed him to react faster than most people. He almost subconsciously tried to turn his body to the side, causing his fall to deviate slightly as he lost his balance. It was this slight shift that allowed him to avoid the stem of the nameless plant. However, his head could not avoid it. His head touched a branch hanging from the nameless plant. The branch was where the mysterious tricolored flower was hanging from. Xiaoruofe's heart skipped a beat. Ignoring the pain in his body, he suddenly turned around and his expression changed. He saw that the branches were shaking nonstop, and the 3 petals of the tricolor flower had all fallen off and were falling to the ground. Seeing this scene, Xiaoruofe's heart seemed to be bleeding. Over the past month, he had entered the space almost every day to admire the tricolor flower. He also loved this beautiful flower that seemed to contain the truth of the world. He did not expect that because of his carelessness, all the petals would fall off. Xiaoruofe was filled with regret, but it was useless. He stood up, not bothering to dust himself off, and immediately walked over to the nameless plant. Where a beautiful tricolor flower had originally sprouted from, only a bare crown remained, and it no longer had that inexplicable appeal. Xiaoruofe sighed and squatted down to look at the 3 petals that had fallen to the ground. The red, blue, and yellow petals lay quietly on the ground. Even though they had fallen off the flower crown, they still looked breathtaking. Xiaoruofe did not know what kind of plant this was, nor did he know the origin of this tricolored flower. However, his intuition told him that it must be very precious, because it was the only native in this spiritual space, and it was filled with mystery. Unable to resist, he reached out to pick up the 3 petals. Just as Xia Ruofei's hand touched the yellow petal, there was a sudden change. The yellow petal actually sank into Xia Ruofei's palm with a whoosh and disappeared without a trace, as if it had never existed. This process was too fast. Xia Ruofei did not have time to react at all. He could not help but open his mouth in shock. In the next moment, Xia Ruofei felt a heat surge through his body. A warm feeling made him feel as if he was soaking in hot spring water. Even his soul was trembling with pleasure. He could not help but let out a comfortable moan. Although Xia Ruofei had participated in the extermination of many drug gangs, he had never taken drugs. However, he was certain that even when a drug addict was on drugs, it was impossible to experience this floating sensation. This process lasted for about half a minute before slowly disappearing. Xia Ruofei felt deeply unsatisfied and could not help but extend his hand towards the second petal. When his hand touched the blue petal, as expected, the petal instantly sank into his palm. Immediately after, the familiar fluttering sensation attacked again. Soon, the blue petals were also absorbed by Xia Ruofei. At this moment, he had no other thoughts and reached for the last red petal without hesitation. The entire process was completely subconscious and not within his control. It was not until the red petal was completely absorbed that Xia Ruofei came back to his senses. Only then did he realize that his body seemed to have changed drastically. The faint sense of weakness that he had felt since his illness had long disappeared. The familiar strength seemed to have returned, and Xia Ruofei could clearly feel that he was much stronger than when he was at the peak of his strength. What was going on? What were those tricolored petals? Xia Ruofei could not help but open his mouth wide. He took a deep breath and exhaled. As Xia Ruofei exhaled, a black mist came out of his mouth, startling him. This mist had a fishy smell. Xia Ruofei quickly took a few steps back. It was then that he realized that he was also covered in this stench. His skin had been caked with a dark layer of dirt. Could it be that the petals had expelled the virus and impurities from my body? A thought surfaced in Xia Ruofei's mind. He didn't have time to think too much about it, because the sticky feeling was too uncomfortable, and he stank. This stench was a little overwhelming, even for a special forces soldier, who could once lurk in a smelly pond for a few days. So he couldn't wait to get a rinse. Xia Ruofei naturally would not be so extravagant as to bathe in the water of the spiritual pool, so he left the spiritual map space without hesitation. Everyone in the rental apartment shared a small bathroom. Fortunately, most of the tenants had gone out to work during the day. Otherwise, Xia Ruofei's stench would really have stink up the place for everyone. He quickly found a change of clothes and hurried into the public bathroom. He turned on the shower and started to rinse. After washing 3 times, Xia Ruofei finally washed all the dirt off his body. He changed into cotton pajamas and walked out of the public bathroom in a refreshing manner. Then he opened all the windows in the public area. When he passed by previously, even the small public living room was filled with that pungent smell. He had to open it to ventilate it. Otherwise, it would be bad if the other tenants came back and smelled the stench. After doing all this, Xia Ruofei returned to the small room he had rented. When he was bathing previously, Xia Ruofei had already vaguely felt that after absorbing the tricolored petals, all his illnesses seemed to have healed. That familiar feeling of power almost made him cry. Ever since he was diagnosed with ALS, Xia Ruofei's world had been gray. It was a terminal disease, even worse than cancer. For one thing, there was no effective treatment for ALS at the moment. Of course, what was even more terrifying was that patients with the disease would feel as if they were slowly being frozen. At first, only a finger might lose its sensation. Eventually, it would spread to every bone, muscle, organ, and even their tongues and eyeballs would be unable to move. Finally, most of them would die of respiratory failure. The most terrifying thing was that throughout the entire journey to death, the patient's mind and senses were conscious. It was equivalent to watching helplessly as his body lost consciousness bit by bit, and he suffocated to death. This process could go on for 2 or 3 years, or even 5 or 6. Imagine how horrible that would be. Death was not the worst thing. The worst thing was waiting for it. And now, because of the 3 magical petals, this terrible disease was cured. The excitement of surviving a calamity was indescribable. Xiao Ruofei sat on his small bed in a daze. He had mixed feelings as he recalled the hardships that he had gone through after he was diagnosed. Now that his illness had disappeared, this former iron-blooded soldier could not help but tear up. After a while, Xiao Ruofei, who had calmed down, stood up and inadvertently glanced at the small mirror hanging on the wall. He could not help but be stunned. His reflection in the mirror seemed different. After many years of harsh training in the army, Xiao Ruofei had learned a lot of martial arts. His skin had also become tanned from the day-to-day training. The muscles on his body were intertwined like dragons. One look and one could tell that he was a powerful soldier. However, the biggest and most obvious change now was that his skin had become much paler. It could even be said to be tender. Many girls would probably envy his skin if Xiao Ruofei walked outside. Also, his muscles were no longer so obvious. His figure became more well-proportioned, and he even looked like a weak scholar. However, Xiao Ruofei knew very well that although the magical tricolored petals had transformed his originally developed muscles, his strength had not decreased at all. On the contrary, be it his reaction speed or physical strength, they were much better than his peak state in the special forces. All of this was brought about by the tricolored petals. Xiao Ruofei looked at himself in the mirror, feeling a little emotional. At this moment, Xiao Ruofei suddenly remembered something and could not help but slap his forehead. He muttered to himself in frustration, "Oh my! Crap! I'm such a pig brain." It turned out that Xiao Ruofei, after completely calming down, had suddenly thought of something. Since this magical tricolored petal could cure his ALS, it might be effective to treat the uremia of his comrade, Hu Zi's mother. While suffering from a terminal illness, Xiao Ruofei was still thinking of ways to make money using the spiritual map space. His original intention was to leave as much money as possible for Hu Zi's mother, at least enough for the kidney transplant. And if the tricolored petals could directly cure uremia, then why bother? However, when Xiao Ruofei realized this, the tricolored petals had already been absorbed by him. Now he could not have them even if he wanted them. Furthermore, Xiao Ruofei could vaguely sense that even if there was only one petal, it could completely cure his ALS. This was because after absorbing the 3 petals, not only did his illness disappear, but his body had also been completely transformed. Although he had yet to verify how powerful he was, Xiao Ruofei knew that his strength had definitely improved greatly compared to before. In other words, he could have saved 2 petals for Hu Zi's mother. Thinking of this, Xiao Ruofei felt even more regretful. Under those circumstances, Xiao Ruofei had no time to think too much. He was almost completely affected by the comfort that came from his soul. The last 2 times he took the initiative to absorb the petals were all subconscious actions. Now that he thought about it, it was too late for regrets. Xiao Ruofei thought for a moment. Those tricolored petals grew on the nameless plant. Since they were flowers, would they bloom again after they withered? Thinking of this, he could no longer sit still. He took out the spiritual map that he had hidden on him and entered the space with a thought. Xiao Ruofei took 3 steps to the nameless plant by the pond, but he was disappointed. There was still only a bare flower crown on the plant, and no new petals grew. Xiao Ruofei sighed. It was useless to regret now. He could only hope that the petals would grow again after some time. However, Xiao Ruofei was not confident about this at all. After all, this nameless plant was native to the spiritual map space. He knew nothing about this plant. Xiao Ruofei walked around the succulents and vegetable garden, then glanced at the nameless plant indignantly before leaving the spiritual map space. In the afternoon, Xiao Ruofei arrived at the city people's hospital alone and did a full-body checkup. Although he was almost certain that his ALS had been cured, he still came for a checkup just to be safe. He would feel more at ease this way. There were many tests, and it required several working days before the report could be ready. For this, Xiao Ruofei did not hesitate to spend a few hundred yuan to expedite it. Even so, it took him half a day to get the complete report. The test came back as he'd expected. He was in perfect health condition. Not only were there no illnesses, but many of the indicators were much better than ordinary people. The doctor who read the report said that one look at the report, and he knew that Xiao Ruofei must have been exercising and maintaining a good routine for a long time. Otherwise, his physical indicators could not have been so good. His judgment was confirmed, but Xiao Ruofei felt even more regretful. If he hadn't impulsively absorbed all 3 petals in the morning, he could have used them to treat Hu Zi's mother. However, at this point, Xiao Ruofei was not someone who would keep harping on the past. He quickly adjusted his mood and took a taxi back to his rental apartment in the slums. After Xiao Ruofei returned home, he carefully locked the door and entered the spiritual space. He first went to the pond to check on the nameless plant. However, the result was still disappointing. There was still only a bare flower crown on the nameless plant. No petals grew out. Then he went to check on the succulents. To his relief, these succulents were full of vitality. If nothing went wrong, they should all be alive. Now, he just had to wait a few days before he could take a photo and upload it for sale in the online store. After patrolling around, Xiao Ruofei came to an empty space. He casually posed in a stance, and his entire aura immediately changed. If someone who knew martial arts were here, they would be able to tell at a glance that this was the Yang's Taiji stance. This was taught to him by his squad leader when he first joined the army. This squad leader Yang was from Hebei Yongnian and was said to be the direct descendant of the Yang Taiji. At that time, a new comrade in the class had learned the Yang's Taiji from squad leader Yang. Meanwhile, Xiao Ruofei was the fastest to master it and was also deeply liked by squad leader Yang. When the new recruits were allocated to different squads, Xiao Ruofei was also assigned to his squad leader's previous squad. Later on, he participated in the selection for the fresh blood of the Lone Wolf Commando Brigade. Xiao Ruofei was successfully selected before leaving squad leader Yang's side. However, his martial arts ability did not fall behind. When he was free, Xiao Ruofei would practice a few rounds of Taiji Fist. This time, after absorbing the tricolored petals, not only did his illness disappear, but he also felt that his body had been greatly strengthened. Hence, Xiao Ruofei wanted to verify how much his body had been strengthened. Grabbing the sparrow's tail with the right, left single side, hand lifting, white crane spreading its wings. His movements were like flowing water without any delay. Xiao Ruofei's joy grew. In the past, when he practiced, although he was very familiar with every move, he had never felt this feeling of integration. Squad leader Yang also commented that Xiao Ruofei's Taiji was skilled in form, but not in the spirit. Xiao Ruofei felt the same way. No matter how skilled he was, he could not do it freely. Now, all the hesitation had disappeared. After a full set of Taiji, he felt refreshed. There was even a faint heat in his lower abdomen. Xiao Ruofei practiced Tai Chi over and over again, and his movements became increasingly refined. He did not even follow the standard Tai Chi movements of the Yang Consortium, but there was a very natural and smooth feeling that was filled with the charm of the Yang's Tai Chi. There was a sense of winning with no moves. After practicing 5 times in a row, Xiao Ruofei finally stopped. Clearly, the benefits of those 3 petals were far more than just reaction speed and physical strength. This enhancement was definitely comprehensive in all aspects. Xiao Ruofei could not help but look at the nameless plant again, his eyes filled with burning anticipation. "I hope the tricolor flower can grow back," Xiao Ruofei muttered to himself. In the next day or two, Xiao Ruofei entered the space several times a day. Other than taking care of the succulent plants, his main purpose was naturally to check on the nameless plant. But he was always disappointed. The flower crown was still bare, and there was no sign that it was about to bloom again. On the other hand, the succulents had all come to life and were still growing. They should be able to be photographed and uploaded soon to be sold in the online store. On the 3rd day, Xiao Ruofei entered the space again. Every day he had to come in to maintain the vegetable patch and water the succulent plants. As soon as he entered the space, Xiao Ruofei subconsciously looked at the nameless plant. Although he had been disappointed countless times in the past 3 days, Xiao Ruofei was still filled with intense anticipation. This time, his eyes focused on the nameless plant. Then his face lit up with joy. Xiao Ruofei saw at a glance that the flower crown of the nameless plant had grown petals again, and there was more than one. There were still 3 petals, red, yellow, and blue, almost identical to before. When the tricolored flower grew out again, the entire nameless plant immediately had that inexplicable attraction that matched the principles of heaven and earth. Xiao Ruofei was extremely excited. He jogged all the way to the nameless plant and looked at the beautiful tricolor flower. He was so excited that his lips were trembling slightly. With the petals, Hu Zi's mother's illness could be cured. Xiao Ruofei's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the tricolor flower. Just as his hand was about to touch the petals, he suddenly realized something and quickly retracted his hand as if he had been electrocuted. At the same time, he broke out in a cold sweat. In his excitement, Xiao Ruofei had almost forgotten the most important thing. As long as the tricolored petals touched his hand, they would be directly absorbed and could not be plucked. Xiao Ruofei frowned and thought for a while. He felt that there was no other way. He could only try to pluck and preserve the petals without touching them with his hands. He walked to the side. There were a few boxes on the side, and they contained all the junk from the old house that he had sorted out. The rental apartment was too small to accommodate them, so he brought them all to the spiritual space to store. Xiao Ruofei rummaged around and found a first aid kit. He opened it and took out a pair of tweezers. After thinking about it, he felt uneasy. He took out some gauze and wrapped it around the forceps to prevent them from hurting the petals when he picked them. Then Xiao Ruofei found another small plate and walked to the nameless plant. He took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and reached for the tricolor flower. He touched the blue petals gently with the tweezers, and his heart began to race. The petals shook slightly after being held by the forceps, but there was no change. Xiao Ruofei secretly heaved a sigh of relief, then carefully used the tweezers to grab the blue petal. With a little force, the petal fell off the flower crown. Xiao Ruofei placed the petals into the small plate and then repeated the same actions. He plucked the yellow and red petals and placed them in the small plate together. These tricolored petals were infinitely useful, and it seemed that they would grow back 3 days after being plucked. The more, the better. Xiao Ruofei also took the opportunity to test if new petals would grow in 3 days. After picking the petals, Xiao Ruofei began to worry about the small plate with the 3 petals. First of all, the petals could not come into contact with his body at all. Did he have to wear gloves or use forceps to hold them for Hu Zi's mother to absorb it? Moreover, Xiao Ruofei vaguely felt that these flower petals had endless uses. Perhaps they did not even need an entire petal to cure Hu Zi's mother's uremia. Moreover, the soul-piercing comfort when absorbing the flower petals was too strong. All of this meant that if Xiao Ruofei took out the petals like this, the secret might not be kept. If Hu Zi's mother or family let it slip, there would definitely be endless trouble. Moreover, it was a little too shocking for him to rashly take a petal for others to consume. Even if the petal had just touched his lips, it might directly disappear. Xiao Ruofei thought hard for a long time and suddenly had an idea. He left the spiritual map space in a flash and found a bottle of 1L mineral water in the rental apartment. Ever since he had the spiritual map space, he had been using the spiritual pond water, so he had not drunk this bottle of mineral water. Xiao Ruofei opened the bottle and poured out all the mineral water inside. Then, with a thought, he returned to the spiritual map space. He hurried to the edge of the pond and filled a full bottle of water. Then he gently picked up a petal with a pair of tweezers and carefully placed it in the mineral water bottle. Then he looked at it expectantly. As soon as the yellow petals touched the spiritual pond water, they immediately melted without a trace. Moreover, the entire bottle of water was still extremely clear, as if the yellow petals had never existed. Xiao Ruofei heaved a sigh of relief. At the same time, he felt a little uneasy. He raised the bottle to his mouth and took a sip. As soon as the pond water that had fused with the yellow petals entered his mouth, he immediately felt a familiar warmth. He felt extremely comfortable. However, this sense of comfort was completely incomparable to directly absorbing an entire petal. Basically, it would not arouse any suspicion. Only then did Xiao Ruofei feel completely relieved. Because this way, he could easily treat Hu Zi's mother with diluted petal solution. Thinking of this, Xiao Ruofei did not want to wait any longer. He left the spiritual map space with the bottle of water that had fused with the yellow petals. As for the remaining blue and red petals, He carefully placed them in a small box and stored them in the spiritual map space. Xiao Ruofei returned to his room and changed into his clothes. This time, he did not wear desert camouflage clothes. Instead, he dug out the casual clothes he had bought before he joined the army from the simple closet: a pair of jeans, a thin sweater, and a jacket. Xiao Ruofei had never bought casual clothes since he joined the army. The style of this set of clothes was naturally a little old-fashioned. After all, he had bought it many years ago. However, after Xiao Ruofei absorbed the tricolored petals, his entire aura changed. Even though he was wearing ordinary clothes, he still gave off a sunny and refreshing feeling. As he was about to go out, he looked at the large bottle of mineral water in his hand and frowned slightly in thought. He found a small bottle of mineral water and washed it clean before pouring most of the petal solution into it. Then he opened a bottle of grape juice drink that he had not drunk last time. After filling the bottle, Xiao Ruofei closed the cap and gently shook it to let the two liquids mix completely. The liquid in the small mineral water bottle turned light brown and looked a little like a potion. Then Xiao Ruofei found 2 bottles of soda water and poured it into the mineral water bottle, mixing it with the solution. He opened it and took a small sip. It tasted slightly sweet, and at the same time faintly medicinal. Most importantly, the familiar warmth was still there, but it had become even less obvious after being diluted again. Xiao Ruofei tightened the cap of the bottle in satisfaction, then entered the space again with the big mineral water bottle and put it away. Xiao Ruofei could not directly put things into the spiritual space in the outside world yet. He had to bring the items with him. This small bottle of petal solution, mixed with grape juice and soda water, was the medicine Xiao Ruofei had prepared for Hu Zi's mother. After all, this looked more like a potion. The original solution was too clear, no different from clear water. As for the amount, Xiao Ruofei was not worried. Even if this potion could not completely cure Hu Zi's mother's uremia, they could at least relieve it greatly. At worst, he could just deliver the medicine a few more times. Xiao Ruofei put the bottle of medicine into the black military-style satchel, then carried the satchel and left, heading straight for Hu Zi's house. Hu Zi's family lived in Chongping County, a suburban county in Three Mountain City. After Xiao Ruofei left home, he went straight to the South Station. There was a bus from Three Mountain City to Chongping every half an hour. Xiao Ruofei quickly bought the nearest ticket to Chongping from the ticket counter. There was still about 20 minutes to go. Xiao Ruofei left the ticket counter and prepared to enter the bus station. At this moment, there was a commotion at the door. Xiao Ruofei turned around and saw an old man lying on the ground in the distance. Soon, there were people pointing at him. Some people even took out their phones to take photos, but no one went forward. Xiao Ruofei hurried over. At this moment, there were already many onlookers around the old man. Xiao Ruofei squeezed in forcefully, and someone shouted unhappily, "What are you squeezing in for?" Xiao Ruofei had no time to argue with anyone. He saw an old man in his 70s or 80s with gray hair lying on the ground in pain. He must have an acute condition. Xiao Ruofei did not have time to think too much and hurriedly went forward to check on him. At this moment, the onlookers persuaded, "Hey, don't go over there, lad. Be careful not to get cheated of money." "That's right. This old man looks very sick. Don't ask for trouble. Don't go over there. I've already called 120. Xiao Ruofei could not help but smile bitterly in his heart. There were indeed some strange sights in society, such as the famous Nanjing incident. There were also many similar cases, causing many people to not dare to touch the old man after he fell to the ground, afraid of getting into trouble. However, Xiao Ruofei had been trained by the army for many years. He could not watch an old man lay on the ground and do nothing. His conscience could not take it. Therefore, he did not hesitate to take 2 steps forward and squat down in front of the old man. The old man's eyes were tightly closed, and his face was filled with pain. His face was very pale, and his lips were already slightly purple. Xiao Ruofei gently extended a finger to check the old man's breathing. It was already very weak, and he could clearly feel that the old man's skin was cold. Acute myocardial infarction. The words came to Xiao Ruofei's mind. He had received first aid training in the army. He was not a professional doctor, but he could make a rough judgment. His first instinct was to quickly search the old man's body. Under normal circumstances, a patient with heart problems would carry drugs like nitroglycerin, but Xiaoruofei did not find any. Xiaoruofei thought that perhaps this old man did not have a history of heart disease. This time, it might be a completely acute condition, so it was naturally impossible for him to carry heart medicine. He shouted without looking back, "Can someone please call 120? Young man, someone has already called 120. Get up quickly. Don't get into trouble that you can't get rid of," someone reminded him. When Xiaoruofei heard that someone had already called 120, he ignored that person's reminder and directly changed the old man's position to a lying position. He raised the old man's feet slightly and placed his military satchel at his feet. Then, he hurriedly checked the old man's pulse and found that it was also very weak. The old man's condition was getting worse. Xiaoruofei knew that if this continued for a few minutes, the old man would die before the ambulance could arrive. He could not help but become anxious. At this moment, Xiaoruofei's gaze inadvertently landed on the military satchel under the old man's feet. He quickly grabbed the satchel and quickly took out the bottle of grape juice. Then he forced open the old man's mouth and poured the juice into his mouth. After Xiaoruofei put away the bottle of potion, he nervously paid attention to the old man's condition. Although it had already confirmed that the petals were effective against his ALS, this was still a diluted solution. Furthermore, Xiaoruofei was not sure if they could be effective against such a serious myocardial infarction. Fortunately, the petal solution did not disappoint Xiaoruofei. Not long after the old man drank it, his breathing began to steady and strong, and the color slowly returned to his face. Seeing this, Xiaoruofei heaved a long sigh of relief. The onlookers could also tell that after Xiaoruofei fed the old man a liquid of unknown composition, the old man's condition was rapidly improving. They could not help but click their tongues in wonder. The old man had yet to wake up, so Xiaoruofei did not dare to leave. He squatted at the side and paid attention to the old man's condition. After another 5 minutes or so, the old man's breathing was completely steady and his face was back to normal. He frowned slightly at first, then slowly opened his eyes. He's awake. The lad's too good. Yes. I thought the old man was dying just now. The onlookers chattered. What happened to me?" the old man asked weakly. Xiaoruofei said, "Old man, you just fainted. It could be an acute myocardial infarction. How do you feel now?" "My chest is still a little tight, but it's better," the old man said. Xiaoruofei nodded. "That's good. Lie on the ground and don't move. Someone has already called 120. The ambulance will be here in a while. You should go to the hospital for a thorough examination and treatment." Xiaoruofei had only fed the old man 2 or 3 mouthfuls of diluted petal solution. He was doing this to prevent the old man from recovering too rapidly or even jumping around if the effect of the petal solution was too good. That would really be shocking. Now it seemed that he had been right to be careful. He had saved the old man's life without exposing his secrets. Xiaoruofei stood up and said, "Old man, since you're fine, I still have to catch the bus, so I'll leave first. You must go to the hospital for a thorough checkup later. Oh right, it's best to inform your children immediately." With that, Xiaoruofei prepared to return to the station. At this moment, the old man hugged Xiaoruofei's leg. The onlookers immediately discussed. "See, he's going to rip off. I told him not to go over just now. The lad is still too young and inexperienced in society." Xiaoruofei was a little stunned. Could it be that he really met someone who was going to extort him? That old man didn't look like that kind of person. The old man seemed to have heard the discussion beside him. He quickly let go again and said, "Young man, don't misunderstand. I'm not trying to blackmail you. I know you saved my life just now. I just want you to leave me your contact details so I can thank you later." Xiaoruofei relaxed and smiled. "Old man, there's no need to thank me. I'm just acting out of kindness. It's good that you're fine. I'm really going to miss the bus. Goodbye." "Young man, then take my business card. You must contact me later." The old man struggled to take out a business card from his pocket and handed it to Xiaoruofei with trembling hands. Xiaoruofei thought for a moment, then smiled and nodded. He took the business card and put it in his pocket. Then he greeted the old man and quickly left the scene, walking into the waiting room of the South Station. As he entered, he heard the distant wail of an ambulance siren behind him. Xiaoruofei knew that the ambulance had arrived. He was completely relieved. After some time, it was almost time for the bus to depart. Xiaoruofei did not wait long before he boarded the bus heading to Chongqing County. The bus quickly drove out of South Station, stopping and moving slowly in the congested roads of the city. About half an hour later, it got on the expressway and its speed increased. Xiaoruofei had been sitting in his seat with his eyes closed, but he was a little emotional. This pedal solution had a miraculous effect on such a serious acute heart attack. It also gave Xiaoruofei more confidence in curing Hu Zi's mother's uremia. He opened his eyes, took the business card from his jacket pocket, and looked at it. He saw that it was written with the words Professor Tian Ruwen, School of Life Science and Engineering at Three Mountain University. It also had his office phone, personal phone, email, and other information. He did not expect the old man he saved to be a university professor. Xiaoruofei was also slightly surprised. However, this matter was just a small interlude for Xiaoruofei. The reason why he accepted the business card was only to get out as soon as possible, so that he would not miss the bus. He had no intention of blackmailing the man for a reward. It was definitely impossible for him to contact this Professor Tian in the future. Just as the bus Xiaoruofei was on was driving towards Chongqing County, a group of people in white coats were waiting solemnly at the entrance of the Three Mountain City People's Hospital. The medical staff entering and exiting the hospital had clearly become a little reserved. It was obvious that the people in white coats were all supervisors in the hospital. A black Audi A6 approached at high speed and pulled up in front of the hospital's outpatient building. The door on the passenger side opened quickly, and a woman in her early 30s in a beige business suit got out quickly. But before she could walk around to the back seat, the door opened directly and a woman in a small black business suit got out, looking anxious. The woman was in her mid-40s, with delicate makeup on her face. She was in good shape. She looked plump but not fat and had a certain charm. She got out of the car and stood there, her body naturally emitting this aura. This aura must have accumulated over time, and it was impossible for ordinary people to have it. When the hospital leaders waiting in front of the outpatient building saw the Audi, they quickly approached it. However, they did not expect the woman to push open the door and get out without waiting for the secretary to open it. Therefore, the leaders had no choice but to speed up and jog directly to the woman. One of the doctors with gold-rimmed glasses was half a step ahead of the other hospital leaders. He came up to the woman and called out with a hint of respect, "Mayor Tian." If one often followed the local news, they would definitely recognize at a glance that this woman in a black professional suit was the mayor of Three Mountain City, Tian Huilan. She was considered a political celebrity. In a patriarchal society, female officials, especially high-ranking officials, were as rare as phoenix feathers and Qilin horns. However, this Mayor Tian had already risen to a leadership position at the official level when she was around 40 years old. Furthermore, she was the mayor of the provincial capital, Three Mountain City. This was even more eye-catching. Now she had been in office for 5 to 6 years. These 5 to 6 years were also the period of rapid development in Three Mountain City. Her outstanding political achievements were countless. That year was an election year. There were rumors that Mayor Tian would probably take it a step further and replace Secretary Du, who was about to retire. It had to be known that the secretaries of provincial capitals were all concurrent members of the provincial committee. In other words, this female mayor was very likely to become a high-ranking deputy minister soon, and a member of the provincial committee with a lot of power. With the arrival of such a big shot, it was no wonder that the leaders of the City People's Hospital had come out in full force to welcome her. Tian Huilan's face was filled with anxiety. She couldn't be bothered to exchange pleasantries with these hospital leaders and directly asked, "Director He, how is my father?" "Mayor Tian, I went to understand the situation immediately after receiving your call. Professor Tian was indeed admitted to our hospital," Director He quickly reported. "The preliminary diagnosis is an acute myocardial infarction, but don't worry, the situation isn't very serious. His life shouldn't be in danger." When Tian Huilan heard this, she heaved a sigh of relief. Then she frowned and said, "My father's heart has always been quite good. How did he suddenly have a heart attack?" Director, he quickly explained. "Mayor Tian, some cardiovascular diseases might not be very obvious in the beginning. The patient himself might not be able to detect it. Even a routine physical examination might not be able to detect it. Moreover, Professor Tian is already so old. It's normal for some minor problems to appear in his organs." Tian Huilan nodded and said, "Where is my father now, Director He? I've already arranged for Director Chun of Cardiovascular Medicine to follow up personally. A full examination should be underway now. I'll bring you over now." "Director," he said. Tian Huilan nodded and looked at the hospital leaders surrounding her. "Director, he can accompany me. Comrades, go back to work." Originally, the hospital leaders had appeared together to show their importance to their leaders. However, now that the old man was suddenly hospitalized, it was naturally impossible for them to gather around and give instructions like usual. Therefore, the hospital leaders immediately bade farewell and left. Director, he accompanied Tian Huilan and her secretary, Wu Liqian, to the elevator. In the elevator, Director, he received a call. After a few hurried words, he immediately hung up and said to Tian Huilan, "Mayor Tian, Professor Tian has completed the examination. We have arranged for a high-class ward. Then let's go directly to the ward." Tian Huilan immediately said, Okay, Director Ho said, pressing the floor button. They soon arrived at the hospital's high-class ward. It was the best ward in the city's People's Hospital. Not only did it have a small reception room, but it also had a study, an accompanying room, and a small kitchen. The facilities were quite complete. Tian Huilan and the others waited in the ward for a while before they heard Professor Tian's voice coming from the corridor. "Since there's nothing wrong with my body, there's no need to go to the trouble of being hospitalized. I want to go straight back. Professor Tian, acute myocardial infarction is no joke. You have to stay in the hospital for observation." A calm voice said. Tian Huilan quickly opened the ward door and walked out. As soon as she stepped out, she saw her father sitting in a wheelchair with a helpless expression. A young and beautiful female nurse was pushing the wheelchair, and there was a middle-aged doctor in a white coat explaining to him as he walked. This old man was Professor Tian, whom Xia Ruofei had saved at the passenger terminal. Xia Ruofei would never have thought that the old man he happened to save was actually the father of a dazzling female political star. Professor Tian's gray hair was a little messy, and there was a piece of gauze on his forehead. He had knocked his forehead on the ground when he fainted, and he looked much older. Tears welled up in Tian Huilan's eyes. She hurried forward and asked in a choked voice, "Dad, how are you feeling?" When Professor Tian saw Tian Huilan, a trace of displeasure appeared on his face. "Huilan, talk to them. There's nothing wrong with my health. Let me discharge from the hospital immediately." Tian Huilan looked troubled. "Dad, you can't underestimate heart problems. Let's listen to the doctor." After saying that, Tian Huilan shot Director He a look. Director He quickly understood and stepped forward to say, "Professor Tian, acute myocardial infarction is not a small illness. Although there are no major problems with your examination now, to be safe, you still have to stay in the hospital for observation for a day or two. If the condition changes, we can deal with it in time." The middle-aged doctor, who had been accompanying Professor Tian, also said, "Professor Tian, from the results of the examination, although we haven't found any serious problems for the time being, we still need to organize an expert consultation. If you leave the hospital rashly now, there might be unpredictable dangers." Professor Tian shook his head helplessly and said, "I know my own body. Forget it. I'll just stay in the hospital." Professor Tian also knew very well that with his daughter's status, the hospital would definitely not discharge him so rashly. If anything really happened, they would not be able to bear the responsibility. He was already mentally prepared when he informed Tian Huilan. If it weren't for the fact that he had something else for her to do, Professor Tian definitely wouldn't have alerted his daughter. Seeing that her father's tone had softened, Tian Huilan heaved a sigh of relief. She was about to ask about her father's condition in detail when Professor Tian spoke again. "Huilan, Come in with me for a moment. I need to talk to you. Oh, sure. Tian Huilan replaced the female nurse and personally pushed the wheelchair into the ward. Director He and the others naturally wouldn't be so insensible as to follow them in. They all stood at the door and waited. Tian Huilan closed the ward door and turned around. Dad, why did you go out alone again? Didn't I ask little Shun to follow you? Fortunately, it didn't lead to serious consequences this time. Otherwise, Professor Tian waved his hand and said, Let's not talk about this anymore. Huilan, I called you here because I have something for you to do. Go ahead, Tian Huilan said quickly, pretending to listen carefully. Tian Huilan knew that her father had always kept a low profile. Apart from some old colleagues in the university, very few people knew that he was Mayor Tian's father. If he hadn't taken the initiative to call her this time, the doctors at the City People's Hospital definitely wouldn't have recognized him. So it must be something important for her father to do this. Professor Tian said, I was able to turn this situation around thanks to a young lad. If he hadn't given me first aid, I'm afraid I wouldn't have lasted until the ambulance arrived. Then Professor Tian explained what had happened that day. When Tian Huilan heard this, her expression changed drastically. She did not expect her father's illness to flare up so dangerously this time. Now she could not help but feel a chill down her spine, and she was very afraid. Then we really have to thank him, Tian Huilan said. Professor Tian nodded and continued. That's what I'm talking about. However, the scene was very chaotic, and that young man was unwilling to leave his contact details. Although I gave him my business card, I'm afraid he might not take the initiative to contact me. Therefore, immediately arrange for someone to investigate that young man's identity. We have to thank him properly later. Tian Huilan immediately said seriously. I understand. I'll arrange this immediately. There were many surveillance cameras at the scene, and Xia Ruofei had even bought a bus ticket at the counter. With Tian Huilan's status, it was naturally easy to find out his identity. Dad, if there's nothing else, you can rest here. Don't say anything about being discharged, Tian Huilan continued. When she heard that Professor Tian's illness was so serious, her heart was already pounding. She insisted that Professor Tian stay in the hospital. Tian Huilan helped Professor Tian lie down on the bed. After covering him with a blanket, she quietly left the ward. Director He and Director Chun of the cardiology department were still waiting at the door. When they saw Tian Huilan coming out, they quickly stood up to welcome her. Tian Huilan waved at them and then said to her secretary, Little Wu, come here for a moment. The female secretary, Wu Liqing, quickly walked to Tian Huilan's side and asked respectfully, Mayor Tian, what are your instructions? Tian Huilan told little Wu what Professor Tian had instructed her to do in a low voice, then said, You don't have to worry about me. Go and take charge of this now. I want to see the results before work ends this afternoon. Yes, said Wu, hurrying away from the hospital. After Tian Huilan finished arranging Professor Tian's matters, she walked towards Director He and Director Chun and asked, Please tell me about my father's illness. Director He and Director Chun both displayed a strange expression, but they quickly came back to their senses. Director Chun quickly said, Mayor Tian, let's talk in my office. The reason why their expressions were a little strange was because they had just discussed Professor Tian's condition. After Tian Huilan and Professor Tian entered the ward, Director He pulled Director Chun aside to understand the situation. Director Chun originally was confused about Professor Tian's condition. However, since Tian Huilan and Professor Tian were present, he could not say anything. When Director He asked, he naturally spilled everything. It turned out that Professor Tian's examination showed that there was nothing wrong with his heart. Moreover, all the indicators were quite good for Professor Tian's age. There was no sign of a heart attack at all. But the house doctor's diagnosis was acute myocardial infarction. By the time the ambulance arrived at the scene, although the situation was not very critical, his symptoms were very obvious. These were reflected in the house call report. It should be acute myocardial infarction. It was precisely because of these two contradictory results that Director Chun was puzzled. It was impossible for a house doctor to make such a low-level mistake, and the results of this examination were here. There was really no way to explain it. Actually, Director Chun did not know that the petal solution that Xia Ruofei fed Professor Tian had a miraculous effect on all kinds of illnesses. However, Xia Ruofei was worried that it would shock the world, so he did not use much. Otherwise, Professor Tian would be completely fine. It was also because of this that when the emergency doctors arrived at the scene, Professor Tian still had some symptoms of a myocardial infarction. But by the time the ambulance returned to the hospital, the petal solution had completely taken effect, and the lesion in Professor Tian's heart had been completely cured. Director He and Director Chun also looked at each other in puzzlement, unable to come to a conclusion. He couldn't tell Mayor Tian that there was nothing wrong with her father, and that his heart was healthier than most people's, right? He had clearly fainted and was sent to the hospital. Could it be that he was pretending to be sick? Besides, who could bear the responsibility if there were any problems in the future? He was Mayor Tian's father. Therefore, when they arrived at Director Chen's office, they could only be vague when reporting to Tian Huilan. They said that from the examination results, the problem was not very serious and suggested that he stay in the hospital for a few more days for observation. At the same time, they would prescribe some medicine for him to recuperate. When Director He and Director Chun reported to her, there were inevitably some technical jargon mixed in, so Tian Huilan did not understand them fully. But all she had to know was that her father's life wasn't in danger. After listening to the report, Tian Huilan was even more grateful to the young man who had reached out to her father. In her opinion, it must have been the young man who happened to have the first aid treatment for a heart attack that saved her father's life in time. Tian Huilan, who was busy with work, thanked Director He and Director Chun after listening to the report. Then, she returned to the ward to talk to her father for a while. She reminded him to follow the doctor's instructions and stay in the hospital for a few days before leaving the hospital and returning to the city government. Xia Ruofei, who did not know that he had saved the mayor's father, had just arrived at the bus station in Chongping County. All he could think about was treating Hu Zi's mother.